Hey there, tonight we're diving into the ruthless world of ancient Roman tax collectors. What you're about to discover might surprise you. Their methods were less about paperwork and more about intimidation and theatrics. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now make yourself cozy, maybe adjust your room temperature or get that cup of tea, and let's explore tonight's tale together. Welcome to the gritty world of ancient Roman tax collectors. Think of them as the IRS with a toga and a lot less patience. In the Roman Empire, taxes weren't just a polite request. They were the lifeblood of the state, fueling everything from grand temples to the legions that kept the barbarians at bay. And you, my friend, are about to step into the sandals of a Roman tax collector, a job as coveted as it was reviled. First, let's talk about who these tax collectors were. Forget the image of a government employee in a cubicle. In Rome, the role of a tax collector, known as a publicanus, was more akin to a private contractor. These guys would bid for the right to collect taxes in a particular region, a process called tax farming. It's like eBay, but with more political intrigue and fewer cat memes. Once they won the bid, they'd pay the state a fixed sum up front, and then were free to collect as much as they could from the hapless citizens. The difference was their profit. Sounds like a sweet deal, right? Well, it came with its own set of challenges, mainly making sure you collected enough to cover your initial payment while dealing with angry locals who were less than thrilled to see you. Now, what kind of taxes are we talking about? Rome had an impressive array. The tributum was a direct tax on land and citizens, while the vectigal covered indirect taxes on goods, sales, and even slaves. These taxes were the financial backbone of Rome's grand projects. You've heard of the Colosseum? Yeah, that wasn't built on goodwill and magic. It was cold, hard cash from the empire's subjects that kept the gladiators fighting and the aqueducts flowing. But before you get too comfortable with the idea of being a tax collector, let's bust a few myths. The term tax farmer might suggest pastoral simplicity, but don't be fooled. There were no fields of gold here, just a lot of angry taxpayers who might not take kindly to you showing up with your hand out. Tax collectors needed more than just a ledger. They required a thick skin, a strong stomach, and sometimes a small army of enforcers to get the job done. It was a risky business, and not just financially. Collecting taxes could be hazardous to your health, especially when the locals decided they'd had enough of your demands. So why did anyone want this job? Well, the rewards could be immense. Successful tax collectors could amass fortunes, gaining wealth and influence. They could climb the social ladder, rubbing shoulders with senators and generals. But it was a high-stakes game. You had to be shrewd, ruthless, and politically savvy. One misstep, and you could find yourself out of favor, or worse, out of time, courtesy of a sharp dagger. The Romans had a saying, pecunia non alit, money doesn't stink. But when you're knee-deep in the business of squeezing every last denarius from your fellow citizens, you might start to question that. The system was ripe for abuse, and tax collectors were often seen as little better than extortionists. Even Cicero, that famous orator and senator, had a few choice words for them, describing them as the dregs of society. Ouch. But despite the bad press, the empire needed its tax collectors. Without them, Rome's ambitious projects and military campaigns would grind to a halt. So here you are, standing at the crossroads of ambition and animosity. You're not just collecting taxes, you're fueling an empire. It's a job that will take you from the bustling markets of Rome to the farthest reaches of the provinces. Along the way, you'll encounter farmers, merchants, and maybe even a few emperors. Just remember, in a world where power is everything, the real currency is influence. And as a tax collector, you've got plenty of both, if you can survive the game. And speaking of surviving the game, let's talk about the lengths to which Roman tax collectors would go to ensure they came out on top. If you thought modern tax evasion penalties were harsh, you're in for a history lesson that makes an audit look like a day at the spa. Into the world of Roman tax collection methods, where creativity and cruelty went hand in hand, and where the term brutal was practically invented. First up, we have the delightful tactic known as decimation. Now, this wasn't just a catchy term for reducing your stress levels by a tenth. Nope, In the Roman lexicon, decimation meant something far more sinister. Originally a military punishment, it was sometimes adapted for tax purposes. If a group of people defaulted on their taxes, they might be subjected to this grim lardery. Picture this. Every 10th person in a rebellious village or group would be executed. It was a bloody spectacle designed to instill fear and compliance in the rest. Talk about motivation to pay up. But wait, there's more. Roman tax collectors weren't just about the big, dramatic punishments. They had a whole arsenal of persuasive tactics. For instance, if you were a landowner who was behind on your tributum, your precious property might be seized faster than you could say, veni, vidi, vici. Your lands could be auctioned off to the highest bidder, often at a price that was laughably low compared to their actual value. And if that didn't work, don't be surprised if your livestock decided to take an impromptu vacation, permanently. Tax collectors also had the power to imprison defaulters. Imagine being thrown into a dank Roman jail because you couldn't cough up the cash. Suddenly, that overdue library book fine doesn't seem so bad, does it? The Roman legal system gave tax collectors a frightening amount of leeway, allowing them to operate with a mixture of authority and opportunism that could make even the most hardened con artist blush. Of course, these dreaded tactics weren't just about the money. They were a political statement. The empire wanted to remind everyone who was in charge, and there was no better way to do that than by squeezing every last denarius from the populace. Rome wasn't built in a day, sure, but it also wasn't built on trust alone. It was built on the backs of its taxpayers, who were constantly reminded of their place in the grand scheme of things. Now, you might be thinking that these tax collectors were universally hated, and you'd be right, mostly. But like any good villain, they had their supporters. The wealthy elite, who often had cozy relationships with the publicani, saw them as necessary cogs in the machine of empire. After all, someone had to fund those lavish banquets and public games. And let's not forget the Senate, which was more than happy to pocket its share of the tax revenue while turning a blind eye to the methods employed to get it. Yet, the social implications were far-reaching. Tax collectors were often ostracized, viewed as pariahs by their fellow citizens. It was a life of high reward, but even higher risk. Imagine walking through the bustling streets of Rome, knowing that every whispered conversation might be about you. The average Roman citizen saw them as the embodiment of the empire's greed and corruption. Even the term publicani became synonymous with extortion and bribery, a linguistic legacy that still echoes in our modern word publican. But why were these methods so particularly despised? It wasn't just about losing a few coins from the family coffer. The harsh reality was that these taxes could drive families to ruin. In a world where a bad harvest could mean the difference between survival and starvation, the added burden of oppressive taxes could be catastrophic. The social fabric of communities was often torn apart by the strain, with resentment simmering just beneath the surface. And yet, despite the loathing they inspired, tax collectors were a necessary evil. Without them, the grand ambitions of Rome would have crumbled. The legions wouldn't march, the aqueducts wouldn't flow. The empire needed its collectors, even if it loved to hate them. The paradox was that while they were reviled, they were also indispensable. A classic case of damned if you do, damned if you don't. In the end, the methods of Roman tax collection were a reflection of the empire itself. Brutal, efficient, and unapologetically ambitious. They were the iron fist in the velvet glove of Roman power, a reminder that while Rome might offer the world an impressive civilization, it demanded a heavy price in return. And as you stand in those well-worn sandals, navigating the treacherous waters of tax collection, you become acutely aware of the delicate balance between power and perception, a dance as ancient as Rome itself, and just as relentless. Now, let's dive into the nitty-gritty of Roman economics, where the tax collectors you love to loathe were just one cog in the empire's grand machine. It's time to see how their relentless pursuit of denarii affected every Roman soul, from the toga-clad patricians lounging in marble villas to the plebeians hustling in the crowded markets. First up, the patricians, Rome's 1%. They had the luxury of dodging some of the harsher tax realities, often using their connections to minimize their liabilities. Think of them as the ancient equivalent of modern-day billionaires with offshore accounts, except their offshore was probably a nicely bribed senator or two. But make no mistake, they weren't entirely immune. Even the wealthiest Roman felt the pinch of the empire's voracious appetite. Take the land tax, for example. A patrician with vast estates could see a hefty portion of their income vanish faster than you can say Caesar's salad. And while they might grumble over their goblets of Falernian wine, they knew their contributions paved the roads their chariots raced upon and funded the games they so enjoyed from the comfort of their cushioned seats. And speaking of games, let's not forget the bread and circuses. Literally, the taxes extracted from Rome's citizens helped bankroll the gladiatorial games, those bloody spectacles that kept the masses entertained and distracted from their daily struggles. It's a classic case of panem et circenses, or bread and circuses, a strategy to keep the populace appeased while the powers that be went about their empire-building business. It's almost like the ancient version of binge-watching your favorite show to forget your own troubles, only with more blood and fewer cliffhangers. Now let's shift to the plebeians, the backbone of Roman society, and the ones who felt the taxman's bite the hardest. These were your everyday folks, the farmers, craftsmen, and shopkeepers. For them, taxes weren't just an inconvenience, they were a life-altering burden. Imagine, if you will, a farmer in the provinces who's just harvested his crops. He's already at the mercy of nature's whims, droughts, floods, pests, and now he has to part with a chunk of his yield to satisfy the tax collector's demands. It's not just his livelihood at stake, it's his family's survival. And if he's unlucky enough to have a bad year, the tax collector doesn't offer a rainy day fund. Nope, he's more likely to seize what little the farmer has left, leaving him to face a winter of discontent. The economic strain didn't just stop at the fields. It permeated every aspect of Roman life. Merchants and artisans, already working on razor-thin margins, found themselves squeezed by taxes on goods and sales. This wasn't just a trickle-down effect. It was a full-on economic landslide. And while the patrician class might have had the luxury to grumble and move on, for the plebeians, it could mean the difference between making rent and facing eviction, or worse, falling into debt slavery. And here's where it gets even trickier. Rome's expansion, while initially a boon for the empire's coffers, eventually turned into a double-edged sword for its citizens. Conquering new territories meant more land, more resources, and more people to tax. Great, right. Except expanding the empire also meant more military campaigns, more infrastructure, and more administrative costs. It's like inheriting a mansion and then realizing you have to pay for the upkeep. The plebeians, already stretched thin, bore the brunt of this fiscal pressure, as new taxes were often imposed to support the empire's endless ambition. But let's not forget the roads, arguably one of Rome's greatest gifts to civilization. The taxes collected helped build and maintain the extensive network of roads that crisscrossed the empire, connecting cities and provinces like veins in a giant stone body. These roads were vital for trade, communication, and military movement, and they came with a hefty price tag. So every time a Roman citizen trudged down a well-paved via, they were literally walking on their own hard-earned contributions. It's a testament to the paradox of Roman taxation, hated by those who paid them, yet vital for the empire's prosperity. And let's have a moment of silence for the tax collectors themselves, often despised, yet essential. They were the unsung heroes, or villains, depending on who you ask, of Rome's economic engine. Their work, brutal as it could be, was necessary to keep the empire's gears turning. Without their efforts, those grandiose projects and military conquests would have remained mere dreams scribbled on parchment. In the grand scheme of things, Roman taxes were a reflection of the empire's ambition and its inherent contradictions. They funded the decadence of the elite while simultaneously strangling the common folk. They built roads that connected the empire while also driving a wedge between its people. And they were a reminder that, in the world of ancient Rome, nothing came for free, not even a seat at the gladiatorial games. So, as you wander through the bustling streets of Rome with its vibrant mix of cultures and classes, remember that beneath the marble and the grandeur lies a very human story of survival, ambition, and the relentless drumbeat of economic necessity. In the end, the true cost of Rome's glory was borne by its people. Each tax, each denarius, a small sacrifice on the altar of empire. And as we wrap up this part of our journey, keep in mind that the ripple effects of Roman taxation were felt far beyond the empire's borders. They helped shape the very fabric of Roman society, influencing everything from political power plays to the daily lives of its citizens. But fear not, our exploration of this ancient world is far from over. We've only scratched the surface of the complex web that was Roman economics, and there are still more stories to uncover, more myths to debunk, and more truths to reveal. So, stay tuned as we continue to unravel the fascinating tapestry of Rome's financial legacy. As we continue our journey into the labyrinthine world of Roman tax collectors, let's peel back the layers of myth and legend that have enshrined these figures as the ultimate villains in our historical imagination. Why are tax collectors so often the bad guys in both ancient and modern tales? Well, buckle up, because we're diving into the murky waters of perception, power, and propaganda. First, let's sketch the scene with a little help from ancient literature. Roman tax collectors didn't exactly get the best press. In fact, they were more likely to end up as the punchline in satirical plays or the cautionary tale in moralistic writings. Take, for instance, the works of Plautus, whose comedies often featured cunning, avaricious characters that bore more than a passing resemblance to the publicani. These plays were the Netflix of ancient Rome, and the audience loved a good laugh at the expense of the empire's taxmen. Then, there's the biblical angle. Tax collectors make frequent guest appearances in the New Testament, and spoiler alert, they're almost always the baddies. They're depicted as greedy, corrupt, and morally bankrupt, the kind of people who'd sell out their own grandmothers for a few extra coins. Remember Zacchaeus, the diminutive tax collector of Jericho. He's the exception that proves the rule. His repentance is so noteworthy precisely because it was so rare. When you have to climb a tree to see salvation coming, you know you're on the social fringe. But why this universal disdain? It's not just because they took your money, though that certainly didn't help. The real kicker is that tax collectors were seen as collaborators with the Roman state, the enforcers of an oppressive regime. They were the face of the empire's greed, the ones who knocked on your door demanding tribute, while the true architects of the system wined and dined in distant villas, their hands clean and their consciences clear. Speaking of distant villas, let's talk about how these narratives served the Roman elite. For the patricians and senators, tax collectors were a convenient scapegoat. The elites could sit back and let the publicani take the flak, all while reaping the benefits of a well-oiled tax machine. It's a classic case of deflection, a time-honored strategy that's as old as politics itself. By painting tax collectors as the villains, the real power brokers could distance themselves from the dirty work and keep their reputations untarnished. And here's a plot twist. This demonization of tax collectors wasn't just a Roman pastime. Fast forward to modern times, and you'll find that the stereotype has endured. From Ebenezer Scrooge to IRS agents in movies, the tax collector remains a symbol of cold-hearted bureaucracy. It's as if these figures are the embodiment of every receipt we've ever misplaced, every refund we've ever had to chase. They're the face of fiscal fear, the personification of the state's relentless pursuit of our hard-earned cash. Yet, while these tales of villainy are entertaining, they obscure a more complex reality. The truth is, tax collectors were a necessary cog in the imperial machine. Without them, Rome's grand projects would have withered like a grape on the vine. They were the unsung architects of the empire's infrastructure, the unheralded funders of its military might. Sure, they were ruthless, but in a world where power was everything, ruthlessness was just a job requirement. So, let's take a step back and consider the human side of this story. Picture a tax collector in the provinces. Let's call him Gaius, since that's about as common as naming your cat Fluffy. Gaius isn't just a faceless villain. He's a guy trying to make a living in a system that rewards cunning and punishes failure. He's out there in the dust and chaos, trying to balance his books while keeping his head attached to his shoulders. It's not about greed, it's about survival. And survival wasn't just a personal concern. The empire itself was locked in a constant struggle to sustain its vast territories. Each denarius collected was a small but vital piece of the puzzle, a contribution to the grand experiment of Roman civilization. The irony is that while tax collectors were reviled, they were also indispensable. Without their efforts, the roads would crumble, the aqueducts would dry up, and the legions would be left twiddling their swords. Now, don't get me wrong, this isn't a plea for sympathy. The system was rife with corruption, and many a tax collector lined his own pockets at the expense of the common folk. But it's important to see the full picture, to understand that these figures were more than just the pantomime villains of history, were products of their time, shaped by the same forces of ambition and necessity that drove the empire itself. So, the next time you hear someone gripe about taxes, spare a thought for our ancient friends, the publicani. They were the original middle managers, caught between the demands of the state and the wrath of the people. It's a thankless job, but someone had to do it. And in doing so, they left a legacy that's as enduring as the roads they helped pave. As we move forward, keep in mind that the story of Roman taxation is far from over. We've got more layers to uncover, more myths to debunk, and more truths to reveal. So, stick around as we continue to unravel the tangled threads of Rome's financial tapestry, exploring the ways in which this ancient system still echoes in our modern world. Stay tuned, because the best, or perhaps the most revealing, is yet to come. So, let's get down to brass tacks, or should I say, denarii. What were the long-term consequences of Rome's tax practices, and why should we care today? For starters, Rome's tax system was a double-edged sword. On one side, it was the financial bedrock that supported the empire's grandeur. On the other, it was a relentless burden that could send the average Roman spiraling into financial ruin faster than you can say, veni, vidi, vici. And here's the kicker. The echoes of these ancient economic strategies are still reverberating through our modern tax systems. First off, let's talk about the similarities. The concept of tax farming might seem like a relic of the past, but it's not too far removed from modern-day tax agencies contracting private firms to collect overdue taxes. Sure, today's collectors wear suits instead of togas, but the principle remains surprisingly unchanged. Someone else does the dirty work while the state keeps its hands clean. It's a tale as old as time, or at least as old as Cicero's gripes about the publicani. And let's not pretend that the idea of taxes funding public works is a newfangled concept. Roman taxes paid for roads, aqueducts, and public baths, just as our taxes today fund highways, water systems, and public schools. The difference, back then, you might have been paying for an amphitheater where gladiators fought to the death, instead of a stadium where your local team battles for a playoff spot. Call it progress, or just call it a shift in entertainment values. Now, if we could summon the ghost of a Roman tax collector to comment on today's systems, what would he say? Probably something like, "What's with all these tax brackets?" In Rome, taxes were more straightforward, if not downright brutal. You paid what was demanded, and heaven help you if you didn't. Modern tax codes, with their deductions and credits, might baffle a Roman accustomed to a simpler, albeit harsher system. But let's be honest. The average Roman probably wouldn't mind a little complexity if it meant fewer chances of being decimated, literally. But here's where things get really juicy. The Romans taught us an invaluable lesson about the dangers of overaxation. Squeezing the populace too hard can lead to unrest, rebellion, and ultimately, the collapse of your carefully constructed empire. The Roman Empire eventually fell, not solely because of its tax policies, but they were certainly a contributing factor. When your citizens are more concerned about surviving tax season than an invading army, you've got a problem. And while we're on the subject of lessons learned, let's not forget the political implications of taxes. In Rome, taxes were a tool of control, a way to remind the populace of who was in charge. Sound familiar? Today's taxes can still be wielded as political weapons, with debates raging over who should pay what and why. It's a fine line between fair taxation and fiscal tyranny, and it's one that Rome often crossed with little more than a shrug and another round of games at the Colosseum to appease the masses. So, what can we take away from this deep dive into the world of Roman taxes? For one, the more things change, the more they stay the same. The fundamental principles of taxation, funding public goods, maintaining infrastructure, and exerting control, are as relevant today as they were 2 millennia ago. But perhaps more importantly, Rome's story is a cautionary tale of what happens when the balance tips too far in favor of the state at the expense of its citizens. Let's wrap this up with a bit of reflection. The legacy of Roman taxation is one of ambition, ingenuity, and yes, a fair bit of greed. It's a testament to human nature's unchanging drive to build, expand, and occasionally overreach. And while we might not have tax collectors knocking on our doors with an armed escort these days, the specter of Roman fiscal policies remains a haunting reminder of the power and peril of taxation. In the end, the history of Roman taxes is more than a series of numbers and edicts. It's a story about the push and pull between power and the people. It's about the delicate dance of governance, where every denarius collected is a step towards stability or a stumble towards strife. As we navigate our own tax seasons, it's worth remembering the lessons Rome left behind. That prosperity can come at a price, that power must be balanced with accountability, and that the road to ruin is often paved with the best of intentions and a hefty tax bill. So next time you grumble about your taxes, just be glad you're not doing it in sandals. Suleiman the Magnificent's early years were a cocktail of privilege, power, and a touch of the absurd, brewed in the grand halls of the Ottoman Empire. Born in 1494 in Trabzon, a city on the Black Sea that was a little more than a pit stop for traders, and a lot less than a bustling metropolis, he was the only son of Sultan Selim I and Hafsa Sultan. Growing up, young Suleiman probably had more gold spoon-fed into him than cereal, a sign of things to come. But this wasn't just any silver spoon upbringing. His education was as rich as the empire's coffers. Taught by the finest scholars, he was well versed in history, science, literature, and military tactics, all in preparation for the day he'd trade his textbooks for a throne. By 1520, he was ready for his close-up. Suleiman took the reins of an empire that was as vast as it was diverse, spanning from the dusty bazaars of Cairo to the chilly fringes of Hungary. He was 26, an age when most of us are figuring out how to adult, and he was handed the keys to a kingdom that had already gobbled up parts of the Middle East, North Africa, and southeastern Europe. Talk about pressure. Yet, like any good Netflix protagonist, Suleiman was ready to expand the empire's borders further and make sure his dad, Selim I, wasn't the only one getting all the glory. Suleiman was a man on a mission, and that mission started with a little place called Belgrade. Now, in the 1520s, Belgrade was more than just a dot on the map. It was a strategic fortress guarding the Danube River, a critical artery for trade and military movements. Suleiman knew taking Belgrade was like getting the keys to the European front door. So, in 1521, he mobilized a massive army, around 100,000 troops, give or take a few thousand who probably got lost along the way, and laid siege to the city. After a month of hurling cannonballs and shouting insults, Belgrade fell. It was the kind of victory that made neighboring kingdoms sit up and sweat a little. With Belgrade under his belt, Suleiman set his sights on the island of Rhodes in 1522, a jewel of the Aegean Sea held by the Knights Hospitaller. These were no ordinary knights. They were the medieval equivalent of a militarized homeowners association, and they weren't about to hand over the keys to their island paradise without a fight. Suleiman, never one to shy away from a challenge, launched a siege that lasted nearly 6 months. His army dug trenches, built towering siege engines, and basically threw everything, including the kitchen sink, at the knights. When the dust settled, and the knights finally capitulated, Suleiman had added another glittering prize to his collection. But let's not pretend it was all blood and glory for Suleiman. The man had a penchant for the finer things in life, and by finer things, I mean gold and jewels that would make a dragon blush. His love for extravagance was legendary. Picture this: a sultan sitting on a throne inlaid with gold and precious stones, draped in robes that cost more than a small kingdom's GDP. He wasn't just living the high life, he was redefining it. And while some might call this extravagance, others would say it was all part of the job description. After all, nothing says, "I'm in charge," quite like a crown encrusted with enough gems to blind an entire court. Suleiman's early reign was a delicate balancing act between expansion and opulence. He had to manage an empire that was a jigsaw puzzle of cultures and languages, all while keeping his eyes on the prize: more territories, more power, and definitely more bling. He was a ruler who knew that appearance mattered as much as military might, and his early victories were as much about psychological warfare as they were about conquering new lands. In this game of thrones, Suleiman was proving to be a master player, one conquest at a time. Now, while Suleiman was busy decking himself out like a peacock strutting through a medieval fashion show, he wasn't just about the bling. Beneath those glittering robes was a mind as sharp as a scimitar, focused on transforming the sprawling Ottoman Empire into a well-oiled machine. This wasn't just a case of a ruler flexing his muscles, but more of a strategic overhaul with some serious administrative gusto. Enter the canon, Suleiman's piece de resistance in legal reform. The man seemed to have a knack for laws the way some folks have a knack for collecting stamps. But these weren't your run-of-the-mill statutes. The canon was Suleiman's version of a grand legal tapestry, weaving together the empire's existing laws with new regulations that were as precise as they were sweeping. Picture it as the ultimate legislative remix, one that streamlined the chaos of regional rules into a coherent code. And yes, it's as ambitious as it sounds. You see, the Ottoman Empire was a patchwork quilt of cultures and legal systems, each with its own quirks and oddities. Suleiman's genius was in recognizing that to rule effectively, he needed a unified legal framework that could function across the vast and varied territories. The canon was his answer, bringing together civil, criminal, and tax laws under one imperial banner. It was like swapping out a dysfunctional family for a slightly less dysfunctional one, and hoping Thanksgiving dinner would go off without a hitch. Of course, the canon wasn't just about tidying up legal chaos. It was also a clever move to centralize power. By creating a standardized legal code, Suleiman wasn't just streamlining administration. He was pulling the strings of control ever tighter. And oh, how he loved those strings. This was a man who knew that true power lay not just in the battlefield victories, but in the quiet, unglamorous corridors of bureaucracy. In essence, he turned legal reform into a masterclass on power consolidation, all while keeping a straight face that could have rivaled the stoicism of a Renaissance statue. Now, when talking about Suleiman, you can't ignore the colorful cast of characters that populated his court. Chief among them was Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, a man whose rise was as meteoric as it was, well, eventually tragic. Picture this: a Greek slave who climbed the greasy pole of Ottoman politics to become Suleiman's right-hand man. Ibrahim was like that friend who always knew the best spots in town and somehow managed to get a table at the most exclusive restaurants without a reservation. Together, Suleiman and Ibrahim were a dynamic duo, reshaping the empire with a mix of audacity and cunning. Yet, as with many bromances, theirs was fraught with tension, intrigue, and the occasional dramatic fallout. Ibrahim wasn't just a yes-man. He was a visionary in his own right, sharing Suleiman's love for grand projects and reforms. But the higher you climb, the further you have to fall. Spoiler alert. Ibrahim's story ends with less of a bang and more of a quiet, unsettling thud. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Back in the bustling court of Constantinople, Suleiman was busy establishing a bureaucracy that was as intricate as a spider's web, with threads reaching into every corner of his empire. The Ottomans were masters of administration, with a system that was both terrifyingly efficient and bewilderingly complex. Imagine a government so detailed that it could tell you the exact number of sheep in Anatolia while simultaneously managing the flow of spices through Alexandria, and you thought your tax return was complicated. Within this labyrinthine structure, Suleiman's reforms stood out for their sheer audacity. He wasn't content with just reorganizing. He was reinventing. Take the land tenure system, for example. Under his rule, land was no longer a hereditary right, but a privilege granted by the Sultan, turning landlords into stewards of the state. It was a bold move aimed at preventing the rise of rival power bases and ensuring loyalty. Kind of like keeping all the pieces in a chess game glued to the board, with Suleiman holding the only spatula. And then there were the laws that could only be described as, well, bizarre. In his quest for order, Suleiman enacted regulations that ranged from the sensible to the downright peculiar. One law dictated the exact size of loaves of bread, because why not micromanage the bakery while you're at it? Another decree stipulated that tax collectors had to wear distinctive clothing, presumably to make them easier to spot and avoid by the locals. It was a classic case of it seemed like a good idea at the time, except this time the time was the 16th century. Beyond the humor, though, it's clear that Suleiman's legal and administrative reforms were not just about tidying up the empire's affairs. They were a calculated strategy to reinforce his authority and ensure the stability of his vast dominion. He was playing a long game, one that would secure his legacy as a ruler who understood the power of law and order in maintaining an empire. And while he may have been known as the Magnificent, it's this less glamorous side of his reign that truly reveals his genius. As we leave Suleiman tinkering with his empire like a watchmaker with a particularly complex timepiece, it's worth pondering the delicate balance he maintained. Here was a sultan who could command armies, dictate fashion, and refine the legal system, all without breaking a sweat. Suleiman wasn't just a ruler, he was the embodiment of an empire in constant motion, a testament to the power of vision and the importance of a well-tailored robe. But as we know, even the most magnificent of rulers can't escape the trials of time and fortune. Stay tuned, because the story of Suleiman is far from over, and the next chapter promises even more intrigue and drama. Speaking of drama, let's dive into the soap opera that was Suleiman's personal life. Forget reality TV. This was a reality court, and Suleiman was about to star in a saga that would make the Kardashians look like amateurs. Enter Roxolana, a woman whose rise from slave to sultan's wife was nothing short of meteoric. Born in what is now Ukraine, she was captured during a Tatar raid and eventually found herself in the bustling, intrigue-laden halls of the Topkapi Palace. And unlike most rags-to-riches stories, this one was spiced with political maneuvering, razor-sharp wit, and a dash of romance. Roxolana, later known as Hurrem Sultan, wasn't just a pretty face. She was a political powerhouse wrapped in silk. Her influence over Suleiman was legendary, and not without controversy. Imagine being so compelling that you not only capture the heart of the most powerful man in the Ottoman Empire, but also manage to change the course of its history. While Sultan Suleiman was busy conquering lands and rewriting laws, Roxolana was playing her own Game of Thrones, navigating the treacherous waters of palace politics with the grace of a seasoned diplomat and the cunning of a chess master. Her ascent was a seismic shift in a world where the traditional role of women in the Sultan's harem was to produce heirs and then fade into the background, a sort of historical footnote to the main narrative. But Roxolana wasn't content with being a mere background player. Nope, she was here for the leading role. She became Suleiman's legal wife, a move that broke with centuries of Ottoman tradition. This was the 16th century equivalent of flipping the script, and it sent ripples through the court that were felt across the empire. Now, let's get one thing straight. The harem wasn't the hedonistic paradise it's often painted as. Sure, there were opulent surroundings and enough pearls to make a mermaid jealous, but life in the harem was more about politics than pleasure. Think of it as a highly competitive, highly stratified world where alliances were made and broken with the precision of a Swiss watch. Women in the harem wielded soft power, influencing decisions through their proximity to the Sultan. And Roxolana was the undisputed queen of this realm, her influence akin to that of a modern-day political advisor, only with better jewelry. But with power came enemies, and Roxolana was no stranger to bitter rivalries. Her relationship with Suleiman's firstborn son, Mustafa, was particularly fraught. Mustafa was the heir apparent, a popular figure within the empire, and a favorite among the Janissaries, the elite military corps. Yet, in this high-stakes game, Roxolana was playing for keeps. She saw Mustafa as a threat to her own children's future, and what unfolded next was a drama worthy of Shakespeare. In a move that still sparks debate among historians, Suleiman ordered the execution of Mustafa in 1553. The reasons for this decision are as tangled as the threads in a Byzantine tapestry. Some say it was Roxolana's influence, a calculated move to secure her son's positions. Others point to Mustafa's growing power as a potential threat to Suleiman's reign. Either way, the fallout was immense. This decision not only shocked the empire, but also forever changed the dynamics of the Ottoman succession. Roxolana's legacy, like that of her husband, is a complex one. She was a patron of architecture and the arts, commissioning mosques, schools, and hospitals in a bid to leave a lasting mark on the empire. Her philanthropic endeavors were partly an exercise in soft power, showcasing her influence beyond the palace walls and ingratiating herself with the populace. It was a savvy move, one that solidified her position and carved out a legacy in the annals of Ottoman history. As for Suleiman, his relationship with Roxolana was one of the most enduring aspects of his personal life, a partnership that defied the norms of the time and reshaped the Ottoman court. This was no simple love story. It was a testament to the power of partnerships in shaping history. Together, they navigated the complexities of empire, each playing their part in a dance that was as strategic as it was personal. Now, let's zoom out from the intimate quarters of the harem to the grand stage of the empire. While Roxolana was busy crafting her legacy, Suleiman was continuing his relentless pursuit of expansion and consolidation. His campaigns in Europe and the Middle East were not just about territory. They were about securing the future of his dynasty in a world that was as unpredictable as the winds of the Bosphorus. Yet, as with all great empires, the sands of time were shifting beneath Suleiman's feet. The traditional structures of power were evolving, and the challenges of ruling such a vast domain were ever present. The role of the harem, once seen as peripheral, was now central to the politics of the court. It was a microcosm of the larger empire, a place where alliances were forged and broken, where the future of the Ottoman dynasty was decided not only on the battlefield, but also in the whispers of the palace corridors. In the end, the tale of Suleiman and Roxolana is one of power, ambition, and the relentless march of history. It's a story that reminds us that the personal and political are often intertwined, that the decisions made behind closed doors can reshape the world outside. As we continue to explore the life and times of Suleiman the Magnificent, it's clear that his reign was more than just a series of conquests and reforms. It was a tapestry of human relationships, as intricate and colorful as the empire he sought to rule. But hold onto your turbans, folks, because the story isn't over yet. In the next chapter, we'll delve deeper into the twilight of Suleiman's reign, a time of reflection, legacy building, and of course, a few more surprises. The empire was vast, the stakes were high, and the end game was just beginning. As the sun began to set on the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, the shadows cast were long and filled with challenges that would test the very sinews of his empire. His earlier years had been a whirlwind of conquest and reform, but now, in the twilight of his rule, the stage was set for a different kind of drama, one where the stakes were not just territories or titles, but the survival of the empire itself against the backdrop of shifting European alliances and growing military technologies. Our first stop on this farewell tour of Suleiman's martial escapades is the Siege of Malta in 1565, a campaign that was less of a victory lap and more of a strategic facepalm. The Knights Hospitaller, those pesky defenders of Rhodes whom Suleiman had displaced way back in 1522, had set up shop on Malta. This island was more than just a rock in the Mediterranean. It was a thorn in the Ottoman side, positioned perfectly to disrupt sea routes and serve as a launchpad for Christian counterattacks. The Ottomans, being the empire that never met an expansion opportunity it didn't like, decided it was time to evict these knights once and for all. Suleiman's forces, led by the esteemed Mustafa Pasha, landed on Malta with an army of about 40,000 troops. What they lacked in subtlety, they made up for in brute force. The knights, though outnumbered, were nothing if not resourceful. Picture this, a ragtag group of 6,000 defenders holding off the mighty Ottoman machine. It was as if David had rocked up to face Goliath with nothing but a wry grin and an indomitable will. The siege dragged on for 3 grueling months, with both sides suffering horrific casualties. The Ottomans underestimated the resilience of the defenders, and by September, with their supplies dwindling and reinforcements nowhere in sight, they were forced to withdraw. This wasn't just a tactical setback. It was a PR disaster for the Ottomans. The siege had cost them dearly, financially, militarily, and in terms of prestige. The treasury had taken a hit, the troops were demoralized, and in the halls of European courts, the siege's failure was hailed as a divine sign. The myth of Ottoman invincibility had been dented, and it was a bruise that would take time to heal. But Suleiman wasn't one to wallow in defeat. No sooner had he recovered from this Maltese misadventure than he turned his gaze back towards Europe. It was like the empire had a mental map with a big "Here be dragons" scrawled over the Mediterranean, and Suleiman was determined to redraw it. Into the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, a confrontation that would echo through history like the clanging of swords on steel. Now, the Battle of Lepanto wasn't Suleiman's last hurrah, but it was a significant chapter in his military odyssey. The Ottomans, under the command of Ali Pasha, faced off against a coalition of European forces known as the Holy League. This wasn't just a naval engagement. It was a clash of civilizations, fight for control over the Mediterranean, and by extension, the balance of power in Europe. On October 7, 1571, over 400 warships clashed in one of the largest naval battles in history. The Ottomans, with their sleek galleys and seasoned sailors, were confident. But the Holy League had a secret weapon. The galleys, a heavily armed ship that was the naval equivalent of showing up to a knife fight with a bazooka. The battle was brutal, chaotic, and by the end of the day, the Ottomans had lost over 200 ships and an estimated 20,000 men. It was a catastrophic defeat, one that shattered the Ottoman fleet and sent shockwaves through the empire. The economic ripple effects of Lepanto were as significant as the military ones. The cost of rebuilding the fleet strained the Ottoman treasury, which was already groaning under the weight of continuous military campaigns. Trade routes were disrupted, and the loss of naval dominance meant that the Ottomans had to rethink their Mediterranean strategy. Meanwhile, the European powers, once on the back foot, were emboldened by their victory, ready to push back against Ottoman expansion. And then there's the human toll. Thousands of lives lost in the pursuit of territorial expansion and strategic dominance. It's a grim reminder of the cost of empire building, where the valor of soldiers often masked the tragic reality of war. The Ottoman Empire, like any great power, was built on the backs of countless individuals whose stories were lost to the annals of history, their sacrifices the unspoken currency of conquest. As the dust settled on these defeats, Suleiman was faced with the harsh truth that even the mightiest of empires had their limits. The Ottoman juggernaut, while still formidable, was not invulnerable. The economic strain of constant warfare, coupled with the loss of prestige, meant that the empire had to start thinking strategically about its next moves. Expansion for expansion's sake was no longer viable. It was time for consolidation, for tightening the strings on an empire that was beginning to show signs of fraying at the edges. But let's not declare the game over just yet. Suleiman, ever the astute ruler, understood the importance of adaptation. He doubled down on internal reforms, focusing on strengthening the administrative machinery of the empire to ensure that it could weather the storms of history. The Ottomans had always thrived on their ability to adapt, to take the best of what they encountered and make it their own. It was a lesson that Suleiman had learned well, and one that he would pass on to his successors. As we stand on the precipice of the final act of Suleiman's reign, the stage is set for a dramatic conclusion. The empire, though bruised, is far from beaten. There are still battles to be fought, legacies to be cemented, and a future to be shaped. The story of Suleiman the Magnificent is not just one of conquest and glory, but of resilience and reinvention. It's a reminder that history is not a straight line, but a tapestry, woven with the threads of triumph and tragedy, ambition and humility. So as we prepare to dive into the final chapter of Suleiman's life, remember this: empires may rise and fall, but the stories they leave behind endure, echoing through the corridors of time with a resonance that is both profound and enduring. Stay tuned for the culmination of Suleiman's epic journey, a tale of power, legacy, and the relentless march of history. As the curtain falls on Suleiman's reign, the echoes of his legacy are as vast as the empire he once commanded. The man dubbed the Magnificent didn't just leave behind a trail of conquests and legal reforms. He crafted a cultural mosaic that would endure long after the dust had settled on his military campaigns. Suleiman had a penchant for more than just wielding power. He wanted to be remembered as a patron of the arts, a lover of culture, and a builder of monuments that would defy time itself. First on the architectural tour is the Suleimani Mosque, Istanbul's crown jewel and Suleiman's architectural love letter to the empire. Completed in 1557 after 8 years of intricate labor, this wasn't just a place of worship. It was a statement, a 16th century mic drop in stone and marble. Designed by Mimar Sinan, the Ottoman Empire's answer to Leonardo da Vinci, the mosque complex included not just the mosque itself, but also a hospital, a school, a library, and a kitchen that fed the poor. It was like the Ottoman Empire's version of a community center, only with minarets that scraped the sky. But let's not pretend this was just about faith and charity. Suleiman's mosque was also a bit of a flex, a way to say, "Look at what I can build," to both his subjects and his rivals. The mosque's grand dome, spanning 86 feet across, rivaled the grandeur of the Hagia Sophia, a none too subtle nod to Constantinople's Byzantine past. It's like Suleiman took a page from the Roman playbook, only instead of roads, he was laying down some serious architectural swagger. And then there's the matter of cultural renaissance. Under Suleiman's rule, the Ottoman Empire wasn't just a political powerhouse, it was a cultural melting pot. His court buzzed with poets, artists, and scholars, making it a veritable Renaissance fair, minus the turkey legs and jousting knights. Literature flourished, with Suleiman himself dabbling in poetry under the pen name Muhibi. Sure, he could command an army, but could he rhyme? You bet. His poems often reflected his love for Roxolana, adding a personal touch to his otherwise public persona. Yet, for all his contributions to culture and architecture, Suleiman's legacy isn't without its shadows. The very centralized power that allowed him to orchestrate these grand projects also sowed the seeds of the empire's eventual decline. His legal reforms, while initially unifying, inadvertently stifled local autonomy, tightening the reins in a way that future sultans struggled to maintain. It's as if Suleiman handed his successors a finely tuned instrument, but without the sheet music to play it. The economic strain of constant wars, coupled with the need to maintain an opulent court, took its toll on the treasury. The cost of running an empire as expansive as the Ottoman was astronomical, and while Suleiman's reign was marked by prosperity, the cracks were beginning to show. Inflation crept in like an uninvited guest, and the price of silver, the empire's economic lifeblood, fluctuated wildly. The empire's coffers, once overflowing, started to feel the pinch, a harbinger of the financial woes that would plague the Ottomans in the centuries to come. And then there's the matter of succession. By executing Mustafa, Suleiman inadvertently set the stage for a less than stable handover of power. His remaining sons, Selim and Bayezid, were less than stellar candidates. Selim Roman II, who would succeed Suleiman, was more interested in wine than warfare, earning him the nickname Selim the Sard. It's like passing the baton in a relay race, only to realize the next runner didn't quite hear the starter's gun. But let's take a moment to debunk a few myths. Suleiman's moniker, the Magnificent, was as much a testament to his PR skills as it was to his prowess. The European powers, dazzled by his triumphs and terrified of his armies, coined the nickname as a grudging nod to both his splendor and his strategic acumen. It was part admiration, part awe, a cocktail of respect and fear served in a golden goblet. Yet, for all his magnificence, Suleiman was still human, subject to the same frailties and follies as any ruler. His reign was a balancing act between ambition and reality, a dance on the knife edge of power that required constant vigilance and adaptation. In the end, his legacy is a complex tapestry, woven with threads of triumph and tragedy, power and patronage. As we close the book on Suleiman's life, it's clear that his story is more than just a series of battles and building projects. It's a narrative of ambition, tempered by the realities of rule, a testament to the enduring impact of one man's vision on the course of history. Suleiman's empire, like all great empires, was a grand experiment, a test of human will and ingenuity against the relentless passage of time. So, as we bid farewell to Suleiman the Magnificent, let's remember him not just as a conqueror or a builder, but as a symbol of an age when the world was vast and the possibilities seemed endless. His legacy, both golden and tarnished, serves as a reminder that history is not just about what we achieve, but how those achievements resonate through the ages, shaping the world we inherit and the stories we tell. Chaos, dear friends, is the mother of invention, or so they say. And if you ever needed proof, just take a peek at the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period in China. It was like a never-ending game of musical chairs, where every time the music stopped, another ruler ended up on the wrong seat. Picture this. Between 907 and 960 CE, China saw 5 dynastic changes in the north and about 10 kingdoms doing their own thing in the south. This wasn't just a rough patch. It was a full-on, dynasty-sized identity crisis. The political climate was more unpredictable than a reality TV finale. Emperors came and went faster than you could say imperial mandate. The northern dynasties, later Liang, later Tang, later Jin, later Han, and later Zhou, sound like a family reunion where everyone kept changing their name tags. Meanwhile, down south, the 10 kingdoms were living their best lives, kind of like that friend who thrives on chaos and cat memes. They had their own mini-empires, complete with local rulers who were basically the medieval version of big fish in a small pond. Enter Zhao Quanjian, the man who decided enough was enough. He was a talented general, which, in those days, was like being the lead actor in a blockbuster. Everyone knew your name, and your career could be made or broken by a single bad review. Zhao's big break came in 960 CE, when he pulled off what could be considered the medieval equivalent of a corporate merger, the coup d'etat that founded the Song Dynasty. Imagine overthrowing your boss, and then getting promoted to CEO. That's the kind of career leap Zhao made when he took over the throne from the later Zhou Dynasty. Now, let's not romanticize this coup. It wasn't a heroic, destiny-fulfilled moment. It was a calculated power grab. The story goes that Zhao's troops basically strong-armed him into becoming emperor. They supposedly dressed him in a yellow robe, a color reserved for emperors, after a night of drinking. In reality, this sounds like the kind of story you tell your grandkids to make your climb to power sound more like a fairy tale than a hostile takeover. But hey, who doesn't love a good origin story? Zhao Quanjian, now Emperor Tezu of Song, had a vision. He wanted to unify China, bring stability, and maybe finally get some peace and quiet around here. His rise to power marked the end of constant civil strife and the beginning of an era where, believe it or not, innovation was the name of the game. The Song Dynasty wasn't just another chapter in a history textbook. It was a full-blown innovation renaissance. But more on that later. First, let's talk about the impact of this political shift on the average Zhou. Get it? The 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period might have been a nightmare for rulers, but for the everyday folk, it was like living in an endless soap opera with no commercial breaks. With the establishment of the Song Dynasty, life got a bit more predictable. The government was more centralized, which meant fewer surprises, always a good thing when you're just trying to get by. The Song Dynasty also laid the groundwork for economic reforms that would eventually lead to technological innovations. The political stability brought by Zhao's unification efforts meant that people could focus less on dodging the latest power struggle and more on, say, perfecting their rice cultivation techniques. After all, innovations don't just sprout out of nowhere. They need fertile ground, both literally and metaphorically. Under the Song, the population began to boom, growing from an estimated 50 million in the early 10th century to about 100 million by the 13th century. This wasn't just a demographic footnote. It was a game changer. More people meant more brains to think up new ideas, and crucially, more hands to bring those ideas to life. It was like a nationwide Kickstarter campaign for ingenuity. So, while Zhao Quanjian might have stormed onto the scene like a plot twist in a historical drama, his reign set the stage for an era that would change everything. The takeaway here: sometimes, out of chaos comes not just order, but innovation. And the Song Dynasty was about to prove it in a big way. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. There's a lot more to this story, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. Now, as the dust settled, and Zhao Quanjian took his imperial seat, the Song Dynasty dove headfirst into the economic deep end. You see, they weren't just content with a shiny new political regime. They wanted to fiddle with the economic strings too, and boy, did they have a lot to fiddle with. Enter Wang Anshi, the bureaucratic wonderkind with an itch for reforming everything that wasn't nailed down. He was like the Elon Musk of the Song era, minus the Twitter account. Wang Anshi arrived on the scene with a bag full of reforms that were supposed to be the economic panacea for the Song Dynasty's growing pains. And when I say growing pains, I mean the kind you feel when your empire's population doubles and you're scrambling to keep everyone fed and happy. Wang's new policies, as they were called, were something of a mixed bag. Think of Chinese medicine mixed with a splash of modern economics. One key component of his reforms was the Green Sprouts program, which sounds like a vegan brunch spot, but was actually a state-run agricultural loan initiative. The idea was to loan grain to farmers in the spring, hence the Green Sprouts bit, which they'd pay back after the harvest. It was a clever little scheme aimed at smoothing out the bumps in agricultural production and keeping farmers from borrowing money at exorbitant interest rates from the medieval equivalent of loan sharks. This was less about altruism and more about ensuring the state got its cut of the bumper crop pie. But not everyone was thrilled with Wang's plans. Picture this. Your average farmer, used to dealing with local lenders, suddenly has to navigate the bureaucratic labyrinth of state loans. It was like going from borrowing sugar from a neighbor to negotiating a bank loan with paperwork thicker than a bowl of congee. Many folks were skeptical, and quite frankly, they had a point. The program sometimes ended up being more of a bureaucratic boondoggle than a blessing, with reports of local officials mismanaging funds like it was their first day in office. And then there was the matter of taxes. Oh, taxes, the eternal thorn in the side of any empire builder. Wang Anshi's reforms also included a new tax system meant to be more equitable, but it was about as popular as a tax audit. The government started paying officials in grain instead of cash. This might sound quaint, unless you're the official who now has to figure out how to barter for a horse with sacks of rice. The aim was to stabilize the economy and reduce the reliance on middlemen, but it often left officials feeling like they were trading in a medieval farmer's market. Now, let's talk about the piece de resistance of the Song Dynasty's economic adventures, paper currency. Yes, that's right. The Song Dynasty was the first government in the world to issue paper money, setting the stage for every wallet and purse to groan under the weight of paper bills centuries later. But back then, it was revolutionary, or at least it seemed so on paper, pun absolutely intended. Imagine the average Song citizen suddenly being told that the copper coins they'd been using were being swapped out for pieces of paper. It wasn't exactly an easy sell. After all, these folks were used to tangible, clinking coins, not some abstract representation of value. It was like trying to convince your grandparents that Bitcoin is a good investment. The government touted these Jiozi notes as more convenient and harder to counterfeit than coins, which were becoming scarce due to the booming economy. Of course, not everyone was convinced. Some saw these slips of paper as glorified IOUs. The introduction of paper money was not without its hiccups. Initially, the notes were backed by the state, which gave them some credibility. However, when the government started printing more notes than they could back, inflation hit harder than a Mongol invasion. Imagine prices skyrocketing overnight while your pay stubs still read the same. It was enough to make anyone nostalgic for the jingle of coins. But let's not brush off the impact of these changes. Despite the bumps, these reforms laid the foundation for a more sophisticated economy. The Song Dynasty saw an explosion in trade and industry that would have been impossible without these fiscal experiments, even if Wang Anshi's policies were as divisive as a family dinner discussion on politics. They pushed the boundaries of economic thought. In this whirlwind of reform and innovation, the Song Dynasty was carving out a new economic identity. It was a time of bold ideas, some brilliant and some baffling, but all of them contributing to the colorful tapestry of history. And as we ponder the legacy of these reforms, it's clear the Song wasn't just another dynasty. They were the economic pioneers of their time. So next time you pull out a crumpled bill from your pocket, give a nod to the Song Dynasty's paper currency. They were trying to make sense of a rapidly changing world, just like us. And the story, my friends, is far from over. Stay tuned for more twists and turns in this epic tale of innovation and empire building. The Song Dynasty, the period that took the phrase necessity, is the mother of invention and turned it into a national mantra. While the economy was getting a facelift worthy of a modern Instagram influencer, the Song were also busy tinkering with technology in ways that would make even the most jaded modern engineer do a double take. Let's talk gunpowder, the compass, and printing, three innovations that redefined reality in the Middle Kingdom and beyond. First up, gunpowder. The irony here is so thick you could cut it with a knife, or maybe an explosive. Picture this. Taoist alchemists, in their quest for immortality, accidentally invent the means to blow things up. It's like showing up to a vegan potluck with a bucket of fried chicken. Gunpowder was initially cooked up in the 9th century as part of a potion that promised eternal life, but delivered only explosive results. By the time the Song Dynasty rolled around, people were harnessing this accidental invention for more earthly purposes. And when I say earthly, I mean blow up your enemies earthly. The military applications were too tempting to ignore. By the 11th century, the Song were using gunpowder in warfare, crafting weapons like the fire lance, an early ancestor of the firearm. Imagine the surprise on the battlefield when instead of swinging swords and shooting arrows, you hear a bang that rattles the earth. This was a game changer. Folks, the Song military might not have had the manpower of their adversaries, but they sure had the firepower. But gunpowder wasn't just about warfare. The Song people, ever the inventive lot, also used it in fireworks. Because why not? If you can't live forever, you might as well light up the sky while you're here. Fireworks became a staple in celebrations, dazzling crowds with their bright colors and loud bangs, and setting the stage for every future New Year's Eve party. It's as if the Song dynasty looked at the dual use of gunpowder and thought, why choose between destruction and delight when you can have both? Next, let's steer our compass toward, well, the compass. Before this nifty device, navigating the open seas was a bit like trying to find your car in a mall parking lot without GPS, frustrating and prone to wrong turns. The Song dynasty's compass changed the game, using lodestone, a naturally magnetic mineral, to point towards the Earth's magnetic north. This wasn't just a breakthrough for mariners. It was a lifeline for anyone with a poor sense of direction. Now, sailors could venture further from shore without the fear of ending up in the middle of nowhere, or worse, Greenland. The compass was particularly crucial for trade. Remember, this was a time when China was the center of a commercial universe that spanned from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean. The ability to navigate accurately meant more reliable shipping routes, which translated into more trade, and you guessed it, more money. The compass wasn't just a tool. It was an economic engine that propelled the Song dynasty's commercial expansion, making it the medieval equivalent of a venture capitalist's dream come true. And then there's printing. Before the Song dynasty, books were copied by hand, tedious process that made acquiring knowledge feel like a privilege reserved for monks and scholars with more free time than a retiree. Enter Bai Sheng, the unsung hero of the printing world. Around 1040 CE, Bai Sheng invented movable type printing, using clay characters that could be rearranged to print pages quickly and efficiently. This was Gutenberg before Gutenberg, folks. Printing under the Song was like giving the world a megaphone. Suddenly, information could spread faster than gossip in a small town. Books became more accessible, literacy rates climbed, and a cultural renaissance unfolded. The spread of knowledge empowered more people to question, learn, and innovate. It's no exaggeration to say that the Song dynasty's printing revolution laid the groundwork for the intellectual flowering of later centuries. These innovations didn't just change technology, they transformed society. Gunpowder shifted military power dynamics. The compass broadened horizons quite literally, and printing democratized knowledge. The Song dynasty wasn't just tinkering with gadgets. They were reshaping the human experience. And yet, for all their brilliance, they couldn't escape the irony that their quest for eternal life birthed the tools of both creation and destruction. While we marvel at these technological leaps, let's not forget the human stories behind them. The Song dynasty's inventors and thinkers weren't just names in a history book. They were real people with ambitions, dreams, and yes, probably a few failures along the way. Their legacy is a testament to human ingenuity, reminding us that even the most unexpected discoveries can change the course of history. So next time you use a compass app on your phone, watch a fireworks display, or read a printed book, give a nod to the Song dynasty. They were the original tech disruptors, paving the way for centuries of innovation to come. And remember, the story of the Song is far from over. There's still more to uncover in this saga of empire and enlightenment. Stay tuned, because the best is yet to come. Now, as we segue from the Song dynasty's technological triumphs, let's pivot to their cultural and intellectual fireworks. Because, folks, this is where the Song really start to flex their cerebral muscles. Imagine a world where philosophical debates weren't just for ivory tower academics, but were as mainstream as a viral TikTok dance. Welcome to the Song dynasty's cultural renaissance, where ideas flowed like tea at a scholars' gathering. Enter Neo-Confucianism, the philosophical powerhouse of the era. Think of it as Confucianism 2.0, a spiritual and ethical reboot for a society that was already knee-deep in Confucian ideals. Neo-Confucianism was more than just a rehash of old teachings. It was a fresh take on how to live one's life, blending Confucian ethics with elements of Taoism and Buddhism. It was like a philosophical smoothie, mixing the best parts of existing schools of thought into something uniquely Song. And at the heart of this intellectual renaissance was Zhu Zai, the philosopher who might just be the Song dynasty's answer to a TED Talk headliner. Zhu Zai wasn't content to let Neo-Confucianism be a passive, dusty set of ideas. No, he wanted it to be a living, breathing guide to life. His commentaries on the 4 books of Confucianism became the educational foundation for centuries, shaping minds with a blend of moral rigor and cosmic pondering. But let's not get too romantic here. While Zhu Zai was busy elevating the conversation about the nature of reality and the universe, the average Song citizen was probably more concerned with mundane matters like, say, rice prices or avoiding the next tax collector. This was an era where philosophical musings coexisted with the humdrum of daily life, like a medieval version of debating quantum physics while you're stuck in traffic. Neo-Confucianism did have its practical applications, though. It influenced everything from government policies to individual behavior, promoting ideals like filial piety and social harmony. The Song government embraced these teachings as a way to foster stability and order, because nothing says, let's keep the peace, like a good dose of moral philosophy. Yet, the appeal of Neo-Confucianism wasn't just its lofty ideals. It was also its promise of personal betterment, a kind of ancient self-help guide to navigating the complexities of existence. Meanwhile, in the realm of visual arts, the Song dynasty was painting its own masterpiece. Literally. Landscape painting during this time reached heights that would make even the most jaded art critic nod in appreciation. While the Western world was busy with its knights and castles, the Song were perfecting the art of capturing the sublime beauty of nature. These weren't just pretty pictures. They were deeply philosophical statements about man's place in the universe. Artists like Fan Quan and Guo Zai became the rock stars of the painting world, their works revered for their delicate balance of realism and ethereal beauty. Fan Quan's Travelers Among Mountains and Streams, for instance, is more than just a depiction of towering peaks and tiny travelers. It's a visual meditation on man's insignificance in the face of nature's grandeur. And let's face it, nothing puts your problems in perspective like realizing you're just a speck in the cosmic landscape. The Song's landscape paintings were also about capturing the Taoist ideal of harmony with nature. These works weren't just art for art's sake. They were expressions of philosophical ideals, a reminder to anyone who gazed upon them to seek balance in their own life. It was the kind of art that made you pause, reflect, and maybe even ponder your own place in the grand scheme of things. But before you get swept away by the romance of it all, let's remember that for most people, art was a luxury. The reality for many in the Song dynasty was a life governed by work, family obligations, and the occasional existential crisis about whether their rice would grow this season. Yet, in a society that prized intellectual achievement, the cultural output of the Song era provided a rich tapestry of ideas and aesthetics that offered respite, and sometimes inspiration, amid the daily grind. As we marvel at the Song's cultural and intellectual achievements, it's clear that they were more than just a dynasty of inventors and reformers. They were thinkers and dreamers, artists and philosophers, balancing the lofty with the mundane. Their legacy is one of a rich, vibrant society that embraced complexity and contradiction, striving to make sense of a world that was both beautiful and bewildering. So, while Zhu Zai may have been pondering the mysteries of existence, and artists were capturing the sublime on canvas, the average Song citizen was left to navigate the unpredictability of everyday life. It was a time of great ideas and humble realities, of philosophical musings and practical concerns, a dynamic interplay that still resonates today. And remember, we're not done yet. The Song dynasty story is still unfolding, with more twists and turns to come. So hang tight, because the final act promises even more intrigue and insight into this fascinating era of human history. Now, as the curtain rises on the grand finale of the Song dynasty saga, let's take a moment to appreciate the legacy of this remarkable era. It's like watching the credits roll after an epic film, except instead of a list of actors and directors, we've got a century-spanning impact on modern civilization. And trust me, this is one legacy you don't want to sleep through. First, let's talk about the Song's bureaucratic efficiency. Sure, bureaucracy, might be the least sexy word in the English language, but the Song Dynasty made it work like a well-oiled machine. They orchestrated a merit-based civil service system that was the envy of the medieval world. Imagine a job market where your skills actually mattered more than your family connections. What a concept. The imperial examinations became the gateway to governmental positions, ensuring that only the best and brightest got to sit in those coveted seats of power. It was like American Idol, but for scholars, and without the sassy judges. The Song Dynasty's examination system wasn't just about filling government posts. It was a blueprint for social mobility. If you were a bright peasant with a knack for Confucian classics, you could, in theory, climb the social ladder faster than a cat up a tree. However, the exams were no walk in the park. They were grueling, multi-day marathons of mental endurance. Picture a college entrance exam, but stretched out over several days, with your future hanging in the balance. No pressure, right? This system of governance, with its emphasis on merit and efficiency, was a precursor to modern bureaucratic states. It laid the groundwork for administrative practices that would be emulated across the globe, influencing everything from European civil services to modern-day corporate structures. So the next time you're stuck in a queue at the DMV, you can thank or curse the Song Dynasty for pioneering the idea of a structured, albeit sometimes tedious, bureaucracy. But while the Song were busy perfecting their paperwork, they were also looking ahead. Technologically speaking, they were light years ahead of their time. We've already touched on their technological inventiveness with gunpowder, the compass, and printing. But the Song's foresight went beyond gadgets and gizmos. They had an uncanny ability to anticipate the needs of a rapidly changing world, from urban planning to agricultural innovation. For instance, the development of early urban centers in the Song Dynasty was like watching a medieval version of Sim City come to life. Cities like Kaifeng and Hangzhou became bustling metropolises, teeming with markets, shops, and an array of goods that would make any modern-day mall look like a lemonade stand. Hangzhou, with its canals and bridges, was a marvel of urban planning, a city designed to handle the growing demands of trade and population. These cities weren't just centers of commerce. They were melting parts of culture and innovation. Think Paris in the 1920s or Silicon Valley today, sans the Wi-Fi. The Song's agricultural advancements were nothing short of revolutionary. They pioneered new rice strains that could yield multiple harvests a year, transforming the landscape of food production. This wasn't just about filling bellies. It was about sustaining a population that had ballooned to over 100 million by the 13th century. It was like the Green Revolution of the 20th century, but with more silk robes and fewer tractors. Yet, for all their brilliance, the Song Dynasty had its Achilles heel: military overextension and reliance on mercenaries. Oh, mercenaries, history's answer to the gig economy. The Song, despite their technological prowess, struggled with defending their vast empire. Instead of a robust standing army, they often relied on hired swords to do the dirty work. It was a bit like outsourcing your security needs to the medieval equivalent of a temp agency. This might have worked in the short term, but in the long run, it left the Song vulnerable to external threats. The Mongols, led by the formidable Kublai Khan, were not the kind of adversaries you wanted to face with a patchwork army. In 1279, the Mongols swept in and snuffed out the Song Dynasty like a candle in a storm. It was a humbling end for a dynasty that had achieved so much. Yet, it serves as a timeless lesson in the dangers of neglecting the basics of defense while focusing on innovation and expansion. As we reflect on the rise and fall of the Song Dynasty, we see a tapestry of human achievement and folly, a reminder that progress often walks hand in hand with peril. Their legacy is a testament to the power of human ingenuity and the pitfalls of over-reliance on short-term solutions. The echoes of the Song's innovations reverberate through history, from their bureaucratic structures to their technological foresight, leaving an indelible mark on the world. And as we wrap up this historical journey, let's consider what we can learn from the Song Dynasty today. In a world where technology is advancing faster than ever, it's easy to get swept up in the excitement of the next big thing. But the Song story reminds us of the importance of balance, of remembering the fundamentals while reaching for the stars. Whether it's ensuring that our infrastructures are as robust as our innovations, or that our social systems can keep pace with our technological marvels, the lessons of the song are as relevant now as they were 1,000 years ago. So, as we bid farewell to the song Dynasty, let's carry forward their spirit of curiosity and invention, tempered with caution and foresight. Because history has a funny way of repeating itself when we least expect it. And who knows? The next great innovation might just be around the corner, waiting for its own moment in the spotlight. Until then, keep your eyes open and your mind curious, because the story of humanity is far from over. Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, is like the historical version of a mullet, business in the front, party in the back. Around 2334 BCE, this patch of earth was all about the business of empire building, and the loudest name in the room was Sargon of Akkad. Picture this, though not literally, because pictures weren't exactly a thing. Sargon, the guy who went from "who's that?" to "all hail the king," with the kind of speed that would make modern influencers jealous. Sargon's story is one of those, started from the bottom, now we're here, tales that history loves to recycle. According to legend, he was the original rags-to-riches story, allegedly discovered as a baby floating in a basket on a river, because apparently that was the Mesopotamian version of offloading childcare. But let's pause before we get too swept away by all that mythological charm. The truth is, details about Sargon's early years are as foggy as a London morning. What we do know is that he didn't stay anonymous for long. By the time he was done, he was Sargon the Great, ruler of what's often called the first empire in history. Not a bad title for someone who allegedly started out as a basket case. Now, you'd think an empire had to start with a bang, but Sargon's rise was more like a carefully orchestrated crescendo. He was a cupbearer to King Barber of Kish, which sounds like a glorified bartender, but was actually a pretty key gig, placing him right in the palace action. It turns out that mixing drinks was a great way to mix with power. Sargon wasn't just serving the king's ale. He was serving up plans for his own ascent, with a keen eye for opportunities, and perhaps a few strategic poisonings. Because why not add a little Game of Thrones spice? Sargon eventually overthrew Barber. As for military might, Sargon wasn't just rolling dice here. He assembled an army that was the Mesopotamian equivalent of a rock band on a world tour. We're talking about 400 soldiers, which might sound modest today, but back then it was enough to make any city-state quake in its sandals. This force wasn't just for show. They conquered from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. Sargon was laying down the law and laying out his enemies, proving that controlling trade routes was just as important as controlling armies. Economically, Sargon's empire was no slouch either. Mesopotamia was the breadbasket of the ancient world, and Sargon had his fingers in every pie. The empire's backbone was a robust system of agriculture, bolstered by irrigation techniques that turned the region into a literal food factory. This wasn't just about feeding his people, it was about feeding his ambitions. Grain wasn't just sustenance, it was currency, power, and leverage all rolled into one, and let's not forget the political savvy. Sargon didn't just conquer, he consolidated. He installed loyal governors, known as Ensi, to manage city-states while keeping a close eye on them. Think of it as an ancient version of surveillance. He also standardized weights and measures, a move that seems bureaucratic but was revolutionary in creating a cohesive economic system. Sargon's story is a masterclass in power dynamics, but let's not sugarcoat it. His rise wasn't without its ethical conundrums. Ancient sources, like the Sumerian king list, suggest he ruled with an iron fist, and not everyone was thrilled to be part of the Akkadian Empire. But let's face it, nobody ever said building an empire was about making friends. So there you have it. Sargon of Akkad, part military genius, part economic strategist, and part political mastermind. His rise from obscurity to power laid the foundation for what would become the Akkadian Empire, a tale of ambition, conquest, and the occasional myth. As the curtain rises on this historical epic, one thing becomes clear. Sargon didn't just make history. He wrote the book on empire building, and for better or worse, the world would never look back. As the sun set on Sargon's rise, the Akkadian Empire was sprawling like a teenager with a growth spurt. At its peak, this empire wasn't just a string of conquests. It was a masterpiece of administrative engineering. Picture a vast territory stretching over 500, 000 square kilometers, from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, all under the rule of a guy who started life as a basket case. But hold your horses, or chariots in this case, because ruling such a vast domain wasn't a walk in the ziggurat. It required more than just military might. It needed a system, a structure, an empire-sized clipboard of plans. First up, let's talk about the postal system. Now, I know what you're thinking. Postal system. Ancient Amazon Prime. Not quite, but it was revolutionary for its time. Sargon established a network of roads and relays, a kind of ancient pony express, allowing messages to be sent across the empire with unprecedented speed. This wasn't just about delivering love letters or tax bills. It was about maintaining control. Information is power, and Sargon was the grandmaster of keeping his finger on the pulse of every corner of his empire. The postal system ensured that even the furthest flung corners of his realm were never more than a message away from the center of power. It was the internet of its day, minus the cat videos. Next on the agenda, the standardized calendar. Imagine trying to run an empire where everyone's working off a different calendar. It's like trying to schedule a meeting across time zones without Google Calendar. Pure chaos. Sargon implemented a unified calendar to synchronize activities across his empire, from harvests to religious festivals. This wasn't just about keeping everyone on the same page. It was about efficiency. A standardized calendar meant that agricultural cycles could be coordinated, trade could be streamlined, and festivals could be celebrated simultaneously, ensuring that everyone was on the same cosmic wavelength. But the empire wasn't all logistics and admin. It also had a softer side, political marriages. Marriage, the oldest diplomatic tool in the book. From the outside, these unions might look like fairy tale alliances, but peel back the veil and you'll find a pragmatic power play. Sargon and his successors used marriage to forge alliances and cement loyalty among the diverse peoples of the empire. Each union was a strategic move on the chessboard of empire, binding the empire's elites together in a web of loyalty and mutual interest. Love. Maybe. Power. Definitely. Yet here's the kicker, the irony of it all. The more Sargon imposed unity on this patchwork of cultures, the more he inadvertently highlighted their differences. Each city-state had its own identity, language, and traditions. Unifying them was like herding cats with a very fancy leash. Sure, he could enforce a standard calendar and postal system, but he couldn't erase centuries of cultural diversity. The Akkadian Empire was a mosaic, each piece distinct, yet trying to fit into a single picture. And let's not forget the bureaucratic headaches. Managing an empire this size was the ancient equivalent of juggling flaming swords while riding a unicycle. The Ensi, those loyal governors Sargon installed, were crucial in enforcing his policies and maintaining order. But they were also human, which meant they had their own ambitions and agendas. Keeping them in line was a constant challenge. Think of it as a game of political whack-a-mole. Just as you solve one problem, another pops up elsewhere. Now, while Sargon might have been the poster boy for empire building, it's worth noting that not everyone was thrilled with his innovations. For every awe-inspiring postal relay, there was someone grumbling about the newfangled calendar. For every strategic marriage, there was a city-state less than thrilled about losing its autonomy. It was a balancing act, a tightrope walk between innovation and imposition. So, as we leave the Akkadian Empire at its zenith, remember this. The story of Sargon and his empire isn't just one of military conquest and administrative genius. It's a tale of ambition and the eternal quest for control, a dance between unity and diversity that echoes through history. With each innovation, Sargon wasn't just building an empire. He was laying the groundwork for the empires that would follow. But as we'll see, even the mightiest structures can crumble, and the seeds of decline were already being sown amid the empire's peak. Keep that thought in your back pocket, because this empire's story is far from over. But before we let the curtain drop on this act, let's detour into the cultural fireworks of the Akkadian Empire. Because what's an empire without a little artistic flair and some jaw-dropping engineering feats? First up, let's talk literature. You might not think of ancient Mesopotamia as a literary hotspot, but it was a veritable publishing house, minus the Amazon bestseller list. Enter Enheduanna, the world's first known author. If you've never heard of her, buckle up, because she was the Beyoncé of her time, minus the Instagram account. As the high priestess of the moon god Nana in Ur, she wasn't just any poet. She was Sargon's daughter. Yeah, talk about nepotism, but in a time when family ties were the glue holding power structures together, Enheduanna was a literary powerhouse. Her works, like the Exaltation of Inanna, are some of the earliest examples of first-person narrative. She wasn't just writing hymns. She was crafting a PR campaign for her family's divine right to rule. Move over, modern spin doctors, because Enheduanna was spinning tales before it was cool. The Akkadian Empire didn't stop at poetry. It was also a hub of artistic innovation. The art from this era wasn't just about aesthetics. It was a political tool, a way to showcase power and prestige. The famous victory stele of Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson, is a prime example. This massive stone slab doesn't just depict a battle scene, it's a visual manifesto. Naram-Sin stands triumphantly over his enemies, literally larger than life. It's ancient propaganda at its finest, a reminder to any would-be rebels of the might of the Akkadian kings. It's like the Instagram of its day, but instead of selfies, you got a king trampling enemies. Remember, in the ancient world, stone was the original social media platform. Now, let's talk engineering, because the Akkadians were not just about conquering hearts and minds, they were about conquering nature itself. Their irrigation systems were nothing short of a marvel. This wasn't just about watering the crops, it was about transforming the arid landscape into a fertile crescent. The engineering feats involved in creating and maintaining these systems were immense, involving canals that stretched for miles, all designed to harness the unpredictable rivers. It was the ancient equivalent of taming a wild horse with nothing more than a rope and sheer determination. But here's where the myth of the Golden Age starts to crack. While the elite were enjoying the fruits of these advances, the average Akkadian wasn't exactly living the dream. Sure, the irrigation brought bountiful harvests, but it also brought salinization, which slowly turned fertile fields into barren wastelands. Farmers were locked in a constant battle against the environment, and unlike their rulers, they couldn't just commission a new canal when things went south. It was a high-stakes game of agriculture roulette, with the odds heavily stacked against them. And let's not forget the everyday struggles of the Akkadian citizens. While the art and architecture of the empire have left a lasting legacy, the common folk were often living hand-to-mouth. Taxes were heavy, because empires don't fund themselves, and labor was a constant demand. The city of Akkad itself, though grand in design, was a place where the hustle never stopped. Daily life was a grind, with citizens working tirelessly just to keep up with the demands of an empire that never seemed to sleep. Then there's the matter of social stratification. While we tend to romanticize ancient cultures with their grand palaces and temples, life for the average Akkadian was anything but glamorous. Society was rigidly hierarchical, with a stark divide between the elite and the common folk. The upper echelons lived in relative luxury, their lives cushioned by the labor of the masses. Meanwhile, the average worker was toiling in the fields or shops, their lives dictated by the needs of the state. And yet, despite these challenges, the Akkadian Empire thrived, at least for a time. Its cultural achievements were not just a testament to its power, but to the resilience and creativity of its people. The art, literature, and engineering of the Akkadians laid the groundwork for future civilizations, influencing cultures for centuries to come. But as we'll see, the seeds of decline were already taking root, even amid this period of unparalleled achievement. So, as we ponder the legacy of the Akkadian Empire, remember that history isn't just a story of kings and battles. It's the story of people, their struggles, their triumphs, and their enduring quest for meaning in a world that is often as unforgiving as it is inspiring. Keep that thought close as we continue this journey through the rise and eventual fall of one of history's first great empires, because the story is far from over. Now, let's dive into the nitty-gritty of the Akkadian Empire's unraveling, because even the most grandiose of empires can find themselves with one foot in the grave and the other on a banana peel. Picture the Akkadian Empire as a colossal Jenga tower, each block carefully placed to maintain balance. But oh, how easy it is for the whole thing to come crashing down with just a nudge, especially when those nudges come in the form of droughts, rebellions, and the ever-persistent overextension. For starters, let's talk climate, because Mother Nature doesn't take sides, nor does she issue refunds. Around 2200 BCE, the Akkadian Empire faced a colossal climate hiccup, a mega-drought that would have made even the most sun-loving Akkadian beg for rain. This wasn't just a few dry spells. It was a full-blown water crisis that lasted for decades. Imagine trying to run an agricultural empire when your once bountiful fields are as barren as a desert. It was the Bronze Age equivalent of a stock market crash, only instead of losing their shirts, people were losing their livelihoods, and sometimes their lives. Agriculture was the empire's bread and butter, or barley and beer, more accurately. And when the rains didn't come, the empire's economic foundation started to look shakier than a poorly made ziggurat. The once fertile crescent turned into a crescent of despair, as crops withered and food supplies dwindled. Prices skyrocketed, and famine loomed large, casting a shadow over the empire's prosperity. The drought didn't just affect the fields, it seeped into the empire's very core, eroding the social fabric as people struggled to survive. Cue the internal strife, because nothing brings out the rebel in people like an empty stomach. The empire, stretched thin over thousands of kilometers, was a logistical nightmare even on a good day. Now toss in widespread food shortages, and you've got a recipe for rebellion. City-states that once bowed to Akkads might begin to see the cracks in the imperial facade and wondered if maybe, just maybe, they'd fare better on their own. It's like when the popular kid in school loses their cool factor and suddenly everyone jumps ship. Rebellions sprouted like mushrooms after a rainstorm, first in the distant cities and then creeping ever closer to the heart of the empire. The Ensi, those once loyal governors, now found themselves juggling the demands of their rebellious subjects with the orders from Akkad. It was a high-stakes game of political twister, and not everyone was limber enough to keep up. Some Ensi decided to switch sides, throwing their lot in with the rebels, while others were simply overthrown by the very people they were supposed to govern. As if that weren't enough, the empire's military machine began to sputter. The once mighty Akkadian army stretched across a vast territory. It was like a rubber band pulled too taut. With resources dwindling, maintaining such a force became an exercise in futility. The soldiers, once the pride of Akkad, now found themselves underpaid and overextended, facing not just external threats, but the growing discontent within their own ranks. It's hard to inspire loyalty when your soldiers are more concerned about their next meal than their next mission. And let's not forget the logistical hurdles of ruling from afar. The postal system, once a marvel of communication, now found itself bogged down by the sheer distances and the deteriorating infrastructure. Messages took longer to reach their destinations, and by the time orders arrived, the situation on the ground could have changed completely. It was like trying to run a modern corporation with a dial-up internet connection, frustrating, slow, and prone to miscommunication. Meanwhile, the economy, once the empire's backbone, was buckling under the weight of inflation and scarcity. With the agricultural output nosediving, the empire had to rely more on trade, but even that was fraught with peril. Neighboring regions, once eager to trade with the mighty Akkadians, now saw them as vulnerable. Trade routes became battlegrounds for control, and the cost of goods soared as merchants took advantage of the chaos. As the empire struggled to maintain its grip, its cultural and political diversity, once a source of strength, became a liability. The more Akkad tried to enforce unity, the more the distinct identities of its constituent parts pushed back. It was as if the empire was a patchwork quilt slowly unraveling at the seams. Each city-state, with its own language, religion, and customs, began to assert its independence, pulling away from the central authority that had once held them together. In all this chaos, the myth of Sargon's invincible empire began to crumble. The stories of his might and benevolence, passed down through generations, now seemed like echoes from a distant past. The reality was starkly different, an empire teetering on the brink, its foundations eroded by time, climate, and human ambition. It serves as a cautionary tale of how even the most formidable empires can fall victim to the very forces they once mastered. Yet, here's the kicker. The Akkadian Empire, in its decline, set a precedent that history would follow time and again. Overextension, environmental challenges, and internal strife have played out in countless empires since, from Rome to the British Empire. It's a testament to the cyclical nature of history, where each rise inevitably leads to a fall, and every fall leaves lessons for those who come after. But don't pack up your history books just yet, because this saga isn't over. The Akkadian Empire's story still has a few more twists and turns before the final curtain falls. As we continue to unravel the threads of this ancient narrative, remember that every end is merely a prelude to a new beginning. Stay tuned, because the next act promises intrigue, innovation, and the inexorable march of history. And so, as the Akkadian Empire's story unfolds, we find ourselves deep in the rubble of an empire that once reached for the stars, but now found its reach couldn't outpace its grasp. The fall, much like a slowly deflating balloon, was neither swift nor dramatic, but a gradual unraveling that left historians scratching their heads and future generations wondering what went wrong. You see, the Akkadian Empire didn't just collapse overnight. It was a death by 1,000 papyrus cuts, each one a testament to the challenges of maintaining what was once thought to be an unassailable empire. Now, let's talk memory, or the lack thereof. You'd think that the first empire in history would have left a legacy as grand as its ambitions, but the truth is a bit more mundane. The Akkadians, for all their pioneering efforts, were largely forgotten by the time the Babylonians and Assyrians came to power. While Sargon was a household name during his reign, by the time Hammurabi was laying down his laws, Sargon was more myth than man, a cautionary tale of what happens when you bite off more than you can chew. It's a bit like being the first band to play at Woodstock. Sure, you were groundbreaking, but the headliners get all the glory. The Akkadian Empire's innovations, however, left an indelible mark, even if the empire's name did not. Take, for instance, their postal system. It may not have come with tracking numbers or next-day delivery, but it was the backbone of their administration. This was the ancient world's equivalent of a bureaucratic Google Translate, allowing for coordination across vast distances. Future empires, from the Persians to the Romans, would take this idea and run with it, proving that sometimes the most enduring legacies come not from monuments, but from memos. And let's not forget the standardization of weights and measures. In a world where trust was as scarce as rainfall, having a standardized system was revolutionary. It was the ancient version of everyone finally agreeing on the metric system, except, of course, for those stubborn city-states that insisted on doing things their way. This was a key step in creating a cohesive economic system, one that future rulers would tweak and adapt to suit their needs. In fact, you could say that the Akkadians laid the groundwork for modern economics, one standardized shekel at a time. But while the Akkadian Empire's administrative achievements were significant, its political lessons loom even larger. The empire's overextension and inability to maintain control over its vast territories is a tale as old as empires themselves. The lesson here is simple. Biting off more than you can chew is a fast track to indigestion. Future empires, from the Romans to the British, would learn this the hard way, proving that while history may not repeat, it certainly rhymes. When it comes to empire building, sometimes less is more, or at least more sustainable. Then there's the matter of cultural assimilation, or lack thereof. The Akkadians tried to unify a patchwork of city-states with diverse languages, religions, and traditions. It was a noble effort, but ultimately it was like trying to herd cats with a flute. The more they tried to impose a single identity, the more those distinct cultures dug in their heels. It's a reminder that diversity is both a strength and a challenge, a balancing act that modern states continue to wrestle with today. So, as we sift through the remnants of the Akkadian Empire, what can modern states learn from this ancient tale? Well, first and foremost, that innovation is key, but sustainability is crucial. The Akkadians were trailblazers, but their inability to adapt to changing circumstances ultimately led to their downfall. It's a cautionary tale for modern states that prioritize growth at the expense of adaptability. In a world that changes as quickly as ours, those who fail to adapt may find themselves joining the Akkadians in the annals of forgotten history. Finally, let's reflect on the cyclical nature of history. The Akkadian Empire's rise and fall is a template that has played out time and again. Each new empire learns from its predecessors, yet often falls into the same traps: overextension, cultural imposition, and environmental neglect. It's a reminder that while technology and tactics may change, human nature remains remarkably consistent. We build, we conquer, we innovate, and sometimes we overreach. It's the human condition in a nutshell, and the Akkadian Empire is a prime example of this eternal dance. So, as we wrap up this historical journey through the Akkadian Empire, let's tip our hats to Sargon and his successors. They dared to dream big, and while their empire may not have stood the test of time, their innovations did. The echoes of their achievements can still be heard in our postal systems, our economic structures, and our political landscapes. And while the Akkadian Empire may have been forgotten by many, its lessons continue to resonate, proving that even in the fall, there is wisdom to be found. History, after all, is a never-ending story, and the Akkadian Empire is just one chapter in the grand saga of human civilization. Pharaohs, the original celebrity influencers with a godly twist. Imagine a world where the ultimate power couple isn't just ruling a kingdom, but also claiming divine endorsement. That's ancient Egypt for you. The pharaohs weren't just rulers. They were living gods, anointed by the divine to govern, which is a clever PR strategy if you think about it. Why argue about tax policies when you can just say, it's what the gods want? And if you're wondering how this heavenly hierarchy was funded, look no further than the Nile, which was basically the ancient world's version of oil money. With fertile lands producing bountiful crops, the pharaohs amassed wealth that would make modern billionaires green with envy. Let's talk numbers. Ancient Egypt's economy was a powerhouse, churning out resources that filled the royal coffers. Grain, gold, and goods flowed like the Nile itself. The wealth wasn't just about gold-plated chariots and fancy headdresses, though there were plenty of those too. It was about control over resources, people, and the narrative. The pharaohs were masters at weaving a tale as compelling as any epic saga, convincing their subjects that they were not just rulers, but essential cosmic players in the balance of mad, the concept of truth, balance, and order. Behind the pharaoh's divine image, however, were the viziers and high priests, the original right-hand men. These guys were the ultimate fixers, handling everything from the mundane administration of the kingdom to the spiritual well-being of the people. Think of them as the chief operating officers of ancient Egypt, making sure the gears of the kingdom's massive machine ran smoothly. They didn't have corner offices or espresso machines, but they had power, and in a world where power was the ultimate currency, that was everything. The viziers, in particular, were the real MVPs. They were like the Swiss army knives of the ancient government, versatile and invaluable. Tasked with everything from tax collection to overseeing legal matters, they were the pharaoh's eyes and ears across the vast stretches of the kingdom. It's no exaggeration to say that without them, the whole operation might have gone the way of a pyramid scheme. As for the high priests, they ensured the gods were appeased, which in turn kept the pharaoh's divine status intact. Their role was crucial, because in a society where religion was inseparable from daily life, keeping the gods happy was equivalent to maintaining national security. They presided over rituals and managed the wealth of the temples, which were essentially the banks of ancient Egypt. If the viziers were the COO, then the priests were the CFOs, controlling spiritual capital and ensuring the divine economy was as robust as the earthly one. But let's not forget the darker side of this gilded hierarchy. While the pharaohs were living large in their palaces, the system was built on the backs of countless laborers and farmers. The romantic image of a benevolent god-king often glosses over the harsh realities faced by the common folk, whose toil and sweat kept the kingdom running. The pyramids didn't build themselves, and the grain didn't harvest itself either. Yet, the allure of the pharaoh's grandeur is hard to resist, even if it's a bit like admiring a beautifully decorated cake without acknowledging the hours of labor behind it. This top-tier social structure was more than just a way to keep order. It was a narrative crafted to legitimize power and maintain stability. The pharaohs needed to be more than just rulers. They needed to be symbols. In a world without Instagram, they carved their stories into stone, ensuring their legacies would last millennia. And here we are, thousands of years later, still talking about them. Now that's some serious staying power. So, as we peel back the layers of this ancient society, remember that every towering monument and intricate hieroglyph tells a story of ambition, divine politics, and the human drive to leave a mark on history. As we continue our exploration, keep an eye on the power players behind the throne, those viziers and priests who made it all happen, sans the modern perks, but with plenty of ancient swagger. As we leave behind the star-studded court of pharaohs and their trusty viziers, let's slide down the social ladder to meet the scribes, ancient Egypt's geek squad. These guys were the original human search engines, wielding their reed pens with the precision of a neurosurgeon and the flair of a calligrapher. In a society where literacy was as rare as a rainstorm in the desert, scribes were the gatekeepers of knowledge, the keepers of accounts, and the chroniclers of history. Imagine a world where only 1% of the population could read and write. That's right, if you were a scribe, you were part of an elite club more exclusive than a VIP lounge in Vegas. And unlike today's keyboard warriors, scribes had to master the complex script of hieroglyphs, a task that could take up to a decade of rigorous training. Talk about job security. In terms of social currency, they were the Silicon Valley tech wizards of their time, except instead of software, they coded the annals of history. But let's not get too misty-eyed. Being a scribe wasn't all papyrus and glory. Long hours, demanding bosses, and the ever-present threat of ink stains on your linen kilt were part and parcel of the job. Yet, their ability to record and interpret the pharaoh's decrees, tax records, and religious texts granted them significant influence. They were the silent architects of the bureaucratic machine, ensuring the kingdom's cogs turned smoothly. In a way, they were the unsung heroes, or perhaps the unsung workhorses, of the Egyptian economy. Now, switch gears and enter the vibrant world of artisans and craftsmen, the magicians who translated the pharaohs' divine visions into tangible marvels. These were the folks who took limestone, granite, and gold and transformed them into monuments that still awe us today. Imagine being part of the team that built the Great Pyramid of Giza, a project that required over 2 million stone blocks, each weighing as much as a small car. That's not just construction, that's a logistical masterpiece. Artisans were the soul of Egyptian culture, creating everything from the intricate jewelry that adorned the necks of the elite to the vivid frescoes that lined tomb walls. They worked in organized workshops, often within bustling temple complexes, under the watchful eyes of master craftsmen. Despite their remarkable skills, most artisans lived modestly, their homes a far cry from the grandeur of the palaces they helped decorate. It's the age-old paradox of the artist, creating beauty for others while living humbly themselves. And then we have the merchants, the supposed jet-setters of the ancient economy. Picture traders navigating the Nile on reed boats, their vessels laden with exotic goods like incense from Punt or copper from Cyprus. These merchants are often romanticized as the cosmopolitan elite, but the reality was far grittier. Rather than living in opulence, many were more akin to frenetic entrepreneurs, hustling to make a profit in a market where barter was king. The life of a merchant was a constant balancing act, weighed down by the risks of travel and the whims of fluctuating trade routes. While they played a crucial role in connecting Egypt with distant lands, their lifestyle was far less glamorous than the tales suggest. Navigating bureaucratic red tape, haggling prices, and facing the threat of piracy were all part of the package. Their success was not guaranteed by the goods they carried, but by their cunning and resilience, a hustler's game in its purest form. In this ancient tapestry, every thread, from the scribe's ink to the craftsman's chisel, and the merchant's goods, contributed to the rich fabric that was ancient Egypt. Each class had its own role to play, its own story to tell, stories that were as much about survival and adaptation as they were about splendor and achievement. These are tales of the timeless human quest for meaning and legacy, a quest that, much like the great monuments they left behind, continues to stand the test of time. As we continue to unspool the story of ancient Egypt, keep in mind that while the top of the pyramid gets all the glory, it's often the layers below that hold it aloft. The scribes, artisans, and merchants may not have been the face of the god king, but they were the hands and feet of his realm, laboring in the shadow of divinity to carve out their own slice of immortality. So, gear up for the next part of our journey. There's plenty more to uncover beneath the sands of time. While the artisans, scribes, and merchants were busy crafting, recording, and trading, let's shift our gaze to the folks who really put the man in manpower, the laborers who built the pyramids. These iconic structures didn't just pop up overnight, nor were they the handiwork of extraterrestrial contractors with a penchant for geometry. Sorry, History Channel fans, but the truth is far more grounded, literally. The pyramids were the result of sweat, skill, and a well-organized labor force that would make modern project managers weep with envy. First off, let's tackle the myth that these massive monuments were constructed by slaves chained to the rhythm of a drum. Not only is this image inaccurate, but it also does a disservice to the highly skilled workers who took pride in their craft. Recent archaeological evidence suggests that many of these laborers were actually well-fed and well-treated seasonal workers, possibly even volunteers who saw pyramid building as a form of national service, a bit like jury duty, but with more sand and zero air conditioning. Now, about those logistics. The Great Pyramid of Giza, for instance, required somewhere north of 2 million stone blocks, each weighing between 5 and 15 tons. Yeah, that's not a typo. We're talking about moving a small car's worth of limestone over and over again until a giant triangle emerged from the desert. This monumental effort was organized into rotating crews of workers, who were likely divided into teams based on their skills, from quarrying and transportation to the actual construction. So, what drove these workers to pour blood, sweat, and tears into these stone giants? Well, for one thing, their reward wasn't just a pat on the back. Payment came in the form of rations that included bread and beer, because nothing says, "Thank you for your hard work," like a carbohydrate-heavy diet. Beer, in particular, held a special place in the Egyptian heart and stomach. It was the ancient world's version of Gatorade, a calorie-rich beverage that hydrated and nourished workers as they toiled under the scorching sun. Let's not forget the farmers, those unsung heroes who kept the kingdom, quite literally, afloat. While the pyramids were rising, the farmers were busy leveraging the Nile's seasonal flooding to grow the grain that fueled not just the laborers, but the entire Egyptian economy. You see, in ancient Egypt, grain was more precious than gold. The Nile's floodwaters deposited nutrient-rich silt onto the farmlands, creating fertile grounds that produced bountiful harvests. This wasn't just agriculture. It was an economic powerhouse. Grain served as the backbone of the Egyptian economy, essentially functioning as currency. Taxes were often paid in grain, and it was stockpiled to feed the population during lean times. In a sense, the granaries of ancient Egypt were like the Federal Reserve, but with more mice and fewer interest rates. The farmers, therefore, were the linchpins of this system, toiling away not simply to feed their families, but to keep the entire economic machine humming. Now, if you're picturing these farmers as joyless souls shackled to their plows, think again. While life was undoubtedly hard, after all, this was ancient history, not a leisurely stroll through an organic farmer's market. It's a misconception to assume they lived in misery. Many farmers were actually quite savvy, using their off-seasons to participate in state projects like pyramid building, which provided a steady food supply and tax breaks. So, while their lives were arduous, they were also dynamic and multifaceted, much like the Nile's own ebb and flow. In terms of social hierarchy, these laborers and farmers occupied the lower rungs, but they were far from powerless. The stability of the pharaoh's reign, and by extension, the entire kingdom, rested on their shoulders. Without their labor, the grandiose temples and awe-inspiring pyramids could never have been realized, while they weren't writing history with the flourish of a scribe, or chiseling it in stone like the artisans. The impact of their work was no less enduring. Despite the challenges, there was a sense of shared purpose and community among these workers. The labor camps that sprang up around construction sites were bustling microcosms of Egyptian society, complete with bakeries, breweries, and even medical facilities. These were not just places of toil, but also of camaraderie, where workers formed tight-knit bands as they labored together under the watchful eye of the overseers. So, as romantic as it is to imagine aliens or slaves building these monolithic structures, the truth is far more compelling. These were real people with real skills, driven by a sense of duty and a desire for stability, working in a system that was as intricate as the hieroglyphs that recorded their achievements. It's a testament to human ingenuity and resilience, a story that underscores the power of collective effort long before corporate team-building exercises were a thing. As we continue to delve into the layers of ancient Egyptian society, remember that while the pharaohs may have been the face of the kingdom, it was the laborers and farmers who were its beating heart. Their contributions, though less glamorous, were indispensable to the grandeur that history has so kindly attributed to the rulers alone. The pyramids stand as a testament not just to the vision of the pharaohs, but to the countless individuals who, block by block, built their way into the annals of history, one dusty, sun-baked day at a time. As we leave the dusty quarries and fertile fields behind, our journey through the social hierarchy of ancient Egypt continues. Keep your eyes peeled for more tales of resilience, innovation, and the occasional twist of fate as we delve deeper into the lives of those who called this ancient civilization home. There's plenty more to uncover as we venture further into the labyrinth of history, each turn revealing another aspect of the human story etched in the sands of time. As we part ways with the pyramids and their sun-baked laborers, let's shift the spotlight to another cornerstone of ancient Egyptian society, the domestic sphere. Spoiler alert, not every woman in Egypt was a Cleopatra or a Nefertiti, but that doesn't mean their lives were any less fascinating. Women in ancient Egypt enjoyed a surprisingly progressive set of legal rights, which might make you wonder if they were centuries ahead in some respects. While the rest of the ancient world seemed to be playing catch-up, Egyptian women were out here owning property, signing contracts, and generally reminding us that history isn't just a man's game. Now, before you picture Egyptian women as ancient feminists burning papyrus bras, let's set the record straight. The society was still fundamentally patriarchal, with pharaohs and male guards hogging the limelight. However, the legal system was unexpectedly modern. Women could inherit land, initiate divorce, and engage in business dealings. We're talking about female entrepreneurs strutting down the Nile with their own papyrus-stamped deeds. They weren't just sitting at home weaving linen, although, let's be real, linen weaving was quite the art form. Take, for instance, a woman named Nebet, who lived around 2400 BCE. She wasn't just any woman. She was a vizier, a role equivalent to the prime minister. Not many societies back then would let a woman near the levers of power, but Egypt had its exceptions. Of course, Nebet's rise wasn't exactly the norm. Most women still played traditional roles, but the point is, the legal framework allowed for such anomalies, and that's pretty groundbreaking for its time. Marriage contracts were another area where Egyptian women flexed their legal muscles. Forget about prenups modern celebrities love to haggle over. Egyptian women had marriage contracts that clearly outlined financial responsibilities and property rights, ensuring they didn't end up with the short end of the papyrus scroll. These contracts were more than just formalities. They were financial safety nets that provided women with a degree of economic independence. And speaking of financial independence, let's talk about the kiddos. In ancient Egypt, children weren't just frolicking around in loincloths, playing with reed dolls. They were active participants in the family economy. The idea of childhood as a separate, carefree phase of life is a relatively modern concept. Back then, kids were mini-adults in training, learning the family trade, or helping with household chores from a young age. They were the ancient equivalent of unpaid interns, gaining skills crucial for survival in a society that didn't exactly prioritize leisure time. While the notion of child labor might make us cringe today, in Egypt, it was simply part of life. Families depended on their offspring to contribute, whether it was in the fields, workshops, or at home. Sons often followed in their fathers' footsteps, learning crafts or trades, while daughters might assist their mothers in domestic tasks. There was no helicopter parenting here, more like a firm shove into the deep end of life. But don't be too quick to romanticize these industrious little Egyptians. Life expectancy was short, with many children not surviving past infancy due to disease and harsh conditions. For those who did make it, childhood was brief. By the age of 12 or 13, girls were considered marriageable, and boys were expected to start supporting their families. It was a society that prized resilience and maturity, traits that were honed from a young age. In the domestic sphere, women and children formed the backbone of the household economy. They managed resources, stretched supplies, and ensured the family unit functioned smoothly. This was no small feat in a world where the Nile's annual flooding could make or break a year's harvest. Yet their contributions often went unheralded in the grand narratives of pharaohs and monuments. It's a reminder that while history loves its grand tales of kings and conquests, the real stories often lie in the mundane details of daily life. So, as we untangle the threads of ancient Egyptian society, remember that beneath the grandeur and hieroglyphs, there was a vibrant tapestry of human experiences. Women and children, though often relegated to the background, played vital roles that were essential to the kingdom's survival and prosperity. Their stories might not be etched in stone or sung in epic tales, but they're there, woven into the very fabric of history. In the next chapter of our journey, we'll continue to explore the complexities and contradictions of ancient Egypt, where the lines between myth and reality blur like the desert horizon. Stay tuned as we dive deeper into this fascinating world, unraveling more secrets and shedding light on the lives that, while not inscribed in the annals of history, were no less significant. Now, as we drift further down the Nile of history, let's tackle the idea of social mobility in ancient Egypt, an endeavor about as easy as running a marathon in a sandstorm. Picture this. You're a laborer in ancient Thebes, dreaming of a life where you don't have to toil under the sun just to keep the Pharaohs' pyramid scheme from collapsing. The reality, moving up the social ladder, was about as likely as spotting a solar eclipse while being struck by lightning. It wasn't impossible, but you'd need a whole lot of cosmic luck. Yet, for those with the right mix of skill, patronage, and perhaps a dash of good fortune, social mobility was not entirely out of reach. Take a look at the scribes, for example, our ancient geek squad. If you could manage to get yourself educated in the art of hieroglyphs, you were in for a shot at climbing the ranks. Scribes were indispensable, and their rarity made them valuable. They could transition from obscurity to positions of influence within the bureaucracy, and in some cases, they even managed to elbow their way into the upper echelons of society. It's like going from a basement coder to the CEO of a tech giant, minus the stock options and TED talks. Of course, this wasn't your everyday rags-to-riches story. Social mobility in Egypt was more like a game of snakes and ladders, where the ladders were hidden and the snakes were everywhere. You needed a patron, someone in power willing to vouch for you. And even then, your success was often tied to the whims of those above you. One wrong move, and down the snake you'd slide, back into obscurity. Foreign relations and invasions also played a peculiar role in reshuffling the social deck. Egypt wasn't a hermetically sealed kingdom isolated from the world. It was a bustling hub of trade and cultural exchange, as evidenced by the presence of Nubians, Libyans, and other foreign groups in Egyptian society. Sometimes these interactions were harmonious, like a well-rehearsed duet. Other times, they were more of a cacophony, especially when invasions occurred. When the Hyksos rolled into town around 1700 BCE with their horse-drawn chariots and superior weapons, they didn't just bring chaos, they brought change. The Hyksos' rule was a period of foreign dominance, but it also injected new technologies and ideas into Egyptian society. It was like a hostile corporate takeover that, while initially disruptive, eventually led to a more competitive, versatile company. The Egyptians, ever the pragmatists, absorbed these new influences, improving their own military tactics and technologies. The eventual expulsion of the Hyksos was a turning point, demonstrating that while Egypt could be conquered, it could also adapt and emerge stronger. The lasting legacy of Egypt's social structure can still be felt today. The stratification of society, with its rigid hierarchies and divine endorsements, set a precedent that echoes through history. From European monarchies to modern corporate ladders, there's a little bit of pharaoh in every CEO, a hint of vizier in every COO. The myths of divine right and celestial endorsement have been replaced by boardroom strategies and shareholder votes, but the essence remains the same. Power legitimized by a carefully crafted narrative. And then there's the enduring allure of Egypt itself. There's something irresistible about a civilization that built monuments so grand they make modern skyscrapers look like Lego towers. The pyramids, the Sphinx, the treasure-laden tombs of Tutankhamun. These are not just relics of a bygone era. They're testaments to a society that understood the importance of legacy. The ancient Egyptians were masters of propaganda, crafting stories that would endure for millennia. In a world before social media, they managed to go viral with nothing but stone and a chisel. Today, the myths and realities of ancient Egypt continue to captivate our imaginations. Whether it's the mystery of how the pyramids were built or the intrigue of Cleopatra's reign, there's an irresistible pull to these stories. They remind us of the complexity of human achievement and the delicate balance between progress and preservation. The Egyptians understood that while life was ephemeral, stone was eternal. They carved their legacy into the landscape, ensuring their stories would echo down the corridors of time. In the end, the story of ancient Egypt is a tale of ambition, innovation, and the relentless drive to etch one's name into history. It's a reminder that, regardless of the era, people have always sought to rise above their circumstances, to reach for the stars, even when their feet were firmly planted in the sand. So, as we wrap up our journey through the sands of time, take a moment to appreciate the echoes of this ancient civilization that still resonate in our modern world. The pyramids may stand silent, but their stories are louder than ever, whispering tales of a world where the line between myth and reality was as thin as a papyrus reed. Che Guevara wasn't always the beret-wearing revolutionary icon plastered on T-shirts and coffee mugs worldwide. He began life as Ernesto Guevara, a kid in Argentina with a penchant for rugby and a chronic case of asthma. Born on June 14, 1928, in Rosario, Argentina, Che was the eldest of 5 children in a family that leaned more towards intellectual debates than economic stability. His parents, Celia de la Serna and Ernesto Guevara Lynch, gave him a strong foundation in leftist ideology, feeding him a steady diet of Marxist literature alongside his breakfast cereal. Fast forward to his university years, and you'll find Che donning a different kind of uniform, that of a medical student at the University of Buenos Aires. While most medical students were busy pulling all-nighters, memorizing the Krebs cycle, Che was more interested in diagnosing the social ills of South America. He saw medicine not just as a career, but as a tool for social change. And nothing would hammer that belief home more than his legendary motorcycle journey across the continent, a trip that would serve as a catalyst for his revolutionary fervor. Now, let's address the myth of this epic road trip, often depicted with the same romanticism as a James Dean film. In 1951, a 23-year-old Che and his friend Alberto Granado decided to hit the open road, embarking on a journey from Argentina to Venezuela. But hold your horses, or rather your motorcycles. This wasn't an easy-breezy ride with the wind in their hair. Their trusty steed, a battered Norton 500 motorcycle affectionately named La Poderosa, the mighty one, was anything but mighty. This 2-wheeled contraption had seen better days and broke down more often than a teenager's first car. They covered nearly 5,000 miles, and let me tell you, it wasn't all sunsets and scenic vistas. The reality was a lot grittier. Breakdowns in the middle of nowhere, nights spent under the stars with a chorus of mosquitoes as their lullaby, and cultural missteps that could have made a lesser man turn back. At one point, Che and Alberto found themselves in Chile, and just like any traveler on a tight budget, they tried to charm their way into free meals and lodging. Their charisma only got them so far, and they frequently ended up penniless, relying on the generosity of strangers. But it wasn't all mechanical failures and empty stomachs. Along the way, Che witnessed the staggering poverty and social injustice that were as much a part of the landscape as the Andes Mountains. In a Peruvian leper colony, he saw firsthand the stark divide between the wealthy and the destitute, the healthy and the sick. These encounters were transformative. Che began to see the world not just as a series of countries with borders, but as a collection of people with shared struggles. His medical training gave him the tools to heal the body, but his journey gave him the insight to want to heal a society. His travel diary, later published as The Motorcycle Diaries, paints a vivid picture of this eye-opening journey. Sure, there are moments of youthful exuberance and humor, like when they crashed a dance hall in a small town, only to be booted out for not paying the entrance fee. But the diary also holds a mirror to the harsh realities of life in South America, realities that shaped Che's burgeoning political consciousness. It's easy to romanticize this journey, to see it as a coming-of-age story set against a backdrop of exotic locales and vibrant cultures. But the truth was more nuanced. The trip wasn't just about discovering the world. It was about discovering himself and his place in a world that desperately needed change. It was about recognizing that the same diseases he studied in medical school were symptoms of a much larger ailment, systemic inequality and oppression. So while the myth of Che's motorcycle journey might feature him as a rugged adventurer, the reality was far less glamorous and far more significant. It was an odyssey of enlightenment, one flat tire and frugal meal at a time, that set the stage for the revolutionary path he would soon tread. And as he puttered across the continent on that unreliable Norton, Che Guevara was already sowing the seeds of the radical ideas that would later ignite the fires of revolution in Cuba and beyond. As the dust settled on that motorcycle journey, Che Guevara found himself standing at a crossroads, not just geographically, but ideologically. The seeds of revolution were sown, but they needed fertile ground to grow. Enter Fidel Castro, a man whose dreams were as big as his beard. The two met in Mexico City in 1955, and like peanut butter finding its jelly, they clicked. It wasn't long before Che joined Castro's 26th of July movement, a band of revolutionaries plotting to overthrow the Batista regime in Cuba. Spoiler alert, this wasn't just a hobby project for weekends and holidays. These guys meant business. Now, before you romanticize these revolutionaries as swashbuckling heroes in some sepia-toned film, let's get real. Picture a group of 82 men crammed into a yacht named Grandma. Yes, like your grandmother, making a less-than-glamorous voyage from Mexico to Cuba in late 1956. The Grandma was built for maybe 20 passengers, tops. So, if you've ever felt squished on a subway during rush hour, you can sympathize. Their plan was to land in Cuba and swiftly ignite a revolution. What they got instead was a case of Murphy's Law on steroids. They arrived late, got ambushed, and were scattered like a high school marching band in a hurricane. Despite this rocky start, Guevara's role quickly became indispensable. While Fidel was the face and voice of the revolution, Che was the brain and backbone. His strategic mind saw guerrilla warfare not just as a series of battles, but as a chess game where every move counted. Under Che's guidance, the ragtag group transformed into a disciplined force capable of taking on Batista's army. The reality of guerrilla warfare, however, was far from the romanticized image of brave men charging into battle with guns blazing and flags flying. Let's talk logistics, because revolutions aren't won on charisma alone. The Sierra Maestra Mountains became the unlikely headquarters for the rebels, a place where the line between survival and surrender was as thin as the beans in their soup. Che, now a comandante, had to juggle the roles of doctor, soldier, and supply chain manager. Remember his medical training. It came in handy not just for treating combat wounds, but for battling the real enemy, disease. Malaria, dysentery, and infections were more persistent than any government troops. And let's not forget those relentless mosquitoes, which were less a charming nuisance and more a buzzing reminder of Mother Nature's indifference to human conflicts. The economic strain was palpable. The rebels didn't have a Swiss bank account funding their cause. Instead, they relied on the local peasants for support and supplies, often trading their medical services for food. But even the most generous locals couldn't conjure up an endless supply of bullets and beans. It was a constant balancing act. Conserve resources, maintain the morale of the troops, and keep the revolution alive. Yet through sheer grit, they managed to pull off victories that seemed impossible on paper. And the myth of macho heroics, let's debunk that one right here. Sure, there were moments of bravery, but many were born out of sheer necessity rather than choice. Imagine being outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options. Heroism in the Sierra Maestra often looked less like Hollywood and more like grit your teeth and keep moving. Che himself wasn't just barking orders from a safe distance. He was right there in the mud and misery, leading by example, rifle in one hand, asthma inhaler in the other. The charisma that Che exuded wasn't just about his words or his iconic appearance. It was in how he inspired a sense of purpose that transcended the daily grind of survival. He convinced his men that their struggle was part of something bigger, a fight not just for Cuba, but for the oppressed everywhere. This wasn't just a battle, it was a cause. And that's the magic, folks. Because when you're knee-deep in jungle muck with mosquitoes feasting on your ankles, it takes more than a rousing speech to keep you going. It takes belief. As the revolution gained momentum, Che's influence extended beyond the battlefield. He became an architect of the new Cuba, drafting laws, setting up schools, and envisioning a society free from exploitation. But that's a story for another day. For now, let's leave him in the Sierra Maestra, a man not yet a legend, but well on his way. The journey from an Argentine medical student to a Cuban revolutionary icon was never about one man's ego. It was about a shared dream of freedom and equality. And in those mountains, with his eyes set on Havana, Che Guevara was already penning the next chapters of his extraordinary life. Stay tuned, because this revolution is just getting started. And so, the curtain rises on Act 2 of Che Guevara's life. the part where the revolutionary swaps his jungle fatigues for the more bureaucratic attire of a Cuban official. Spoiler alert, this was no seamless transition. Imagine a rock star suddenly attempting to compose symphonies. Ambitious, yes, but fraught with potential for epic fails. She, now a key player in the freshly minted Cuban government, was about to test his Marxist theories against the harsh realities of running a country. First up, his role as Minister of Industries, a title that sounds impressive until you realize it's akin to juggling flaming torches while riding a unicycle. She was tasked with overhauling Cuba's economic model, and he did so with the kind of zeal that would make a caffeine-fueled startup founder seem lethargic. The goal: transform Cuba into a self-sufficient socialist utopia. The challenge: decades of economic dependency on sugar exports and a stringent U.S. embargo that made acquiring resources as easy as finding a needle in a haystack. Chi's solution: diversify, industrialize, and do it all on a shoestring budget. In his typical fashion, Chi dove headfirst into the task, armed with a heady mix of Marxist theory and unshakable confidence. He believed that Cuba could pivot away from its sugar-centric economy by ramping up industrial production. The reality: easier said than done. Chi's plans often collided with the stubborn realities of a resource-starved nation. His ambitious goals included setting up factories to produce everything from shoes to tractors. But when you've got outdated machinery, a shortage of raw materials, and a workforce more accustomed to cutting cane than cranking out consumer goods, you're in for a bumpy ride. Take the infamous year of 10 million, for example. In 1970, long after Chi had left Cuba, the government launched an all-out effort to harvest 10 million tons of sugar, a plan rooted in Chi's earlier focus on sugar as a quick fix for economic woes. It was a Herculean task that required mobilizing the entire country. Students, bureaucrats, even soldiers donned pens and picked up machetes. But despite the massive effort, they fell short, harvesting only 5 million tons. The lesson: you can't simply will an economy into submission, no matter how many people you throw at the fields. Back in the earlier days of his tenure, Chi also attempted to introduce a new currency system designed to eliminate wage disparities and foster a communal work ethic. The idea was that people should work for the love of the revolution, not for money. Admirable in theory, but in practice, it was like asking everyone to subsist on good vibes and revolutionary spirit. Predictably, this didn't exactly boost productivity. Workers accustomed to being paid for their labor weren't keen on the work harder for love model, and the economy stumbled. Chi's stint in economic management was peppered with moments that were equal parts tragic and comedic. His speeches, often delivered with the fervor of a preacher at a revival meeting, were sometimes more stirring than the economic policies they were meant to promote. He famously quipped, "Let me say, at the risk of seeming ridiculous, that the true revolutionary is guided by great feelings of love. Noble, yes, but as it turns out, love doesn't pay the bills or manufacture steel." As Minister of Industries, Chi also embarked on a quest to build a new kind of worker, one who would be motivated by ideology rather than material gain. This campaign included everything from moral incentives to a system of voluntary labor. Chi himself often led by example, participating in voluntary work alongside ordinary Cubans. But the romantic notion of a selfless worker clashed with the ingrained human tendency to want a little something extra for their efforts. Chi's vision was perhaps too idealistic for a society still grappling with the basic tenets of socialism. Now let's tackle the myth of Chi, the charismatic leader, standing at the podium with his iconic beret and impassioned rhetoric. His speeches were a masterclass in revolutionary zeal, but they often glossed over the gritty details of economic management. It's one thing to rally troops in a jungle. It's another to convince a nation that their sacrifices will lead to prosperity. And while his words ignited passions, they didn't always translate into practical solutions for Cuba's economic troubles. Yet, amidst the trials and tribulations, there were moments of genuine progress. Chi's push for literacy and education reforms laid the groundwork for one of Cuba's most enduring legacies, a highly educated populace. He spearheaded campaigns to eliminate illiteracy, believing that an informed citizenry was crucial for the success of the revolution. And in this arena, at least, his efforts bore fruit. By 1961, Cuba declared itself free of illiteracy, a remarkable achievement for a nation in flux. Chi's time as a Cuban official was a whirlwind of idealism, missteps, and occasional triumphs. For every successful initiative, there were setbacks that highlighted the chasm between revolutionary theory and economic reality. Yet, through it all, Chi remained an indomitable force, driven by a belief in the possibility of a fairer world. His legacy as an economist and bureaucrat might not be as celebrated as his exploits on the battlefield, but it's a critical chapter in understanding the man behind the myth. As we wrap up this segment, it's clear that Chi's post-revolutionary life was as complex and multifaceted as the man himself. He was a dreamer tasked with navigating the harsh realities of nation-building, a revolutionary trying to mold a new society from the remnants of the old. And while his tenure as Minister of Industries didn't always yield the results he envisioned, it set the stage for the ongoing saga of Cuba's economic experiment. Stay tuned, because Chi's journey is far from over, and the next chapter promises more twists and turns than a Cuban mountain road. As Che Guevara looked beyond the horizon of Cuba, he saw a world ripe for revolution, or so he thought. Armed with his Cuban success story, Che set his sights on exporting the magic formula of guerrilla warfare to distant lands. Enter Act 3, Che's international escapades, a saga as ambitious as it was ill-fated. First stop, the Congo, where Che attempted to transplant his revolutionary zeal into the heart of Africa. Spoiler alert, it didn't go according to plan. In 1965, fresh off the bureaucratic roller coaster in Cuba, Che ventured into the Congo, seeking to lend a hand, or a fist, more like it, to the country's leftist rebels. The idea was to support the Simba rebellion against the US-backed government. But here's the catch. Che was about as familiar with Africa's complex tribal dynamics as a fish is with a bicycle. He arrived with a group of Cuban veterans, ready to ignite the flames of revolution. Instead, they stumbled upon a cultural and tactical quagmire. Let's start with the numbers. Che had about 120 Cuban soldiers at his disposal, a force dwarfed by the vastness of the Congo's jungles and the complexity of its conflicts. The local rebels, led by Laurent Desiré Kabila, were less than organized. Picture a team of chefs trying to cook up a gourmet meal without a recipe, and the main ingredient missing. Language barriers were just the tip of the iceberg. Che spoke Spanish. The Congolese spoke French and a myriad of local languages. Miscommunication was practically a daily special. Che's attempts to instill his brand of military discipline met with cultural resistance. The Congolese fighters, accustomed to their own methods, were less than thrilled about adopting foreign tactics. Imagine trying to teach a cat to fetch. It's not impossible, but good luck with that endeavor. Moreover, the Congolese climate was unforgiving, and the local wildlife seemed determined to make life miserable. Malaria ran rampant, and the jungles were less a romantic wilderness than a mosquito-infested nightmare. The irony. Here was Che, the celebrated guerrilla mastermind, struggling to replicate his Cuban success on African soil. The romantic notion of the global revolutionary clashed with the gritty reality of logistics and local politics. It turns out, the revolution isn't a one-size-fits-all affair. Che's frustration was palpable, and his letters home were filled with a mix of determination and despair. At one point, he lamented, "This is the history of a failure," a poignant realization that even revolutionary fervor has its limits. But the Congo wasn't the end of Che's international ambitions. Next stop, Bolivia, where Che sought to spark a Latin American revolution. In 1966, he slipped into Bolivia under the alias Adolfo Mina Gonzalez, disguised as a balding middle-aged Uruguayan businessman. If you're picturing a spy thriller with disguises and secret missions, you're not far off. But the reality was less James Bond and more Keystone Cops. Che's plan was to establish a base in the Bolivian mountains, rally the local peasants, and create a domino effect of uprisings across the continent. Unfortunately, Bolivia wasn't Cuba, and the local conditions were anything but favorable. Bolivian peasants had little interest in joining a revolution led by outsiders. They were more concerned with immediate issues like land and survival than abstract ideological battles. The cultural disconnect was stark, and Che's attempts to win over the locals often fell flat. His small band of guerrillas, numbering around 50, faced an uphill battle both literally and figuratively. The Bolivian army, supported by the CIA, was hot on their trail. Once again, Che found himself running low on supplies and allies. The harsh terrain, coupled with a lack of local support, turned the dream of revolution into a desperate struggle for survival. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Che. Here was a man who had once helped topple a government, now evading capture in a foreign land, his grand plans unraveling with each passing day. Che's final days were a far cry from the heroic narratives often spun about him. On October 8, 1967, he was captured by Bolivian forces in the Euro ravine, his asthma acting up and his men scattered. The next day, he was executed in the village of La Higuera. His last words reportedly were, "Shoot, coward. You are only going to kill a man," a defiant end that cemented his status as a martyr of the left. The romantic image of Che as a globe-trotting revolutionary belies the harsh realities he faced. His ventures into the Congo and Bolivia were marked by cultural misunderstandings, logistical nightmares, and a sobering realization that the revolutionary spirit doesn't easily translate across borders. Yet, even in failure, Che's legacy endured. His image became a symbol of resistance, a rallying cry for those seeking change. The myth of Che as the eternal revolutionary lives on, even as the man himself faced the limits of idealism in a stubbornly imperfect world. Che's story isn't just about victories and defeats. It's about the enduring power of belief in the face of adversity. He sought to change the world, not just through battles, but through the ideas that fueled them. And while his international exploits didn't achieve the success he envisioned, they left an indelible mark on the global stage. As his journey came to a close, Che Guevara remained a figure of intrigue, a man whose life and death continue to inspire debate, reflection, and above all, a relentless pursuit of the ideals he held dear. Stay tuned for the final segment, where we'll explore the legacy of Che Guevara, the man and the myth, and the impact of his revolutionary dreams on the world stage. The story of Che is a testament to the complexities of change, the challenges of translating ideals into reality, and the enduring allure of a man who dared to dream beyond borders. And so, as the curtain falls on Che Guevara's tumultuous life, the stage lights focus on the legacy that followed, an ironic twist of fate that would have Che rolling in his unmarked Bolivian grave. The man who once railed against the evils of capitalism has, in death, become one of its most marketable icons. His image, that resolute gaze framed by a beret and wild hair, adorns everything from T-shirts to shot glasses, a testament to the curious alchemy of idealism and irony. Let's pause to appreciate the absurdity here. Che, the staunch anti-capitalist, is now a staple of commercial branding, his face a logo as recognizable as the golden arches of McDonald's. It's as if the universe played a cosmic joke. The revolutionary who fought to dismantle capitalist structures now fuels consumerism. The numbers are staggering. The Che image industry rakes in millions annually, tapping into a kind of rebellious chic that appeals to everyone from teenagers in Tokyo to revolutionaries in Caracas. But why does Che's image endure while others fade into obscurity? Part of the allure lies in the contradictions that defined his life. Che was a man who straddled worlds with the ease of a tightrope walker. He was a doctor who traded in his stethoscope for a rifle, a bureaucrat who dreamed of utopia but grappled with the gritty realities of governance. These contradictions make him relatable, human, even, as if he embodied the struggle of reconciling ideals with action. Beyond the merchandise, Che's mythos continues to shape revolutionary movements worldwide. His life serves as a blueprint, albeit a flawed one, for those seeking to challenge the status quo. From the Zapatista Army of National Liberation in Mexico to the various socialist movements in Latin America, Che's legacy is less about the specifics of his battles and more about the unyielding spirit he embodied. It's the idea that change, however elusive, is worth the struggle, that a single individual, driven by conviction, can still tilt the axis of the world. Yet, it's crucial to separate the man from the myth. Che, the revolutionary, was also Che, the ruthless enforcer. His tenure as a leader of the Cuban Revolution was not without its darker chapters. He oversaw executions, conducted show trials, and had a hand in establishing labor camps. These aren't the parts you'll find on the back of a novelty mug, but they're integral to understanding the full scope of his actions and their consequences. The romanticized vision of Qi often omits the harsh realities of revolutionary justice, a justice that was often swift, brutal, and unforgiving. Qi's legacy is a study in duality, a reflection of human complexity. He is both a hero and a cautionary tale, a symbol of hope and a reminder of the perils of unchecked zeal. His life prompts a re-evaluation of what it means to be revolutionary in a world that constantly shifts beneath our feet. In a society where ideals often clash with pragmatism, Qi's life serves as a mirror reflecting our own struggles to balance dreams with reality. As we wrap up this exploration of Che Guevara's life, it's clear that his story is one of enduring fascination. It's a narrative woven with threads of idealism, contradiction, and a dash of absurdity. Che's journey from the dusty streets of Rosario to the jungles of Bolivia is a testament to the power of belief, the complexity of human nature, and the relentless pursuit of change. Whether you view him as a martyr or a madman, a hero or a villain, Che's life invites reflection on the nature of revolution, the price of ideals, and the enduring allure of a man who dared to dream on a global scale. In the end, Che Guevara remains an enigma, a larger-than-life figure whose legacy continues to inspire and provoke. His story is a reminder that history is not just a collection of dates and events, but a tapestry of human experiences, each thread shaped by the choices we make and the ideals we hold dear. As we close the chapter on Che's life, let's carry forward the lessons of his journey, acknowledge the contradictions, embrace the complexities, and above all, strive to understand the world through the eyes of those who dare to challenge it. They say history is written by the victors, but sometimes it's dictated by the guy with the biggest sword. Enter Charlemagne, or as his pals called him, Charles the Great. If you were hanging around Europe in the 8th century, you'd know him as the Frankish king who roared across the continent like a medieval rock star. But today, we're not just talking about his battlefield antics. We're going to dig into how this warrior king became the unlikely champion of arts and learning in what we now call the Carolingian Renaissance. First, let's set the stage. The Carolingian dynasty didn't just pop up overnight like a medieval boy band. It rose from the ashes of the Merovingian dynasty, which had about as much stability as a game of Jenga on a rickety table. By the time Charles Martel, granddad to Charlemagne, was wielding power, the Merovingian kings were more figurehead than fearsome. Martel, known as the Hammer, wasn't just good at clobbering foes. He laid the groundwork for Carolingian control, famously halting the Islamic advance at the Battle of Tours in 732. His success at Tours wasn't just a military victory, it was a political coup that cemented his family's grip on power. Fast forward to 768. Charlemagne inherits a chunk of the Frankish kingdom from his father, Pepin the Short. Yes, Pepin's moniker might sound like the setup to a joke, but don't let the name fool you. He was instrumental in aligning the Carolingians with the papacy, which was a strategic alliance as brilliant as it was opportunistic. Charlemagne, however, had bigger dreams than just a family fiefdom. He wanted an empire, and boy, did he get one. By the time he was done, his realm sprawled across modern-day France, Germany, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and parts of Italy and Spain. Not too shabby for a guy who started with a kingdom that was, geographically speaking, about the size of a modern European country. Now, conquering half of Europe is one way to make a name for yourself, but Charlemagne wasn't just in it for the land grabs. He had a vision for his empire that went beyond swords and shields. He wanted a cultural revival, an intellectual comeback tour, if you will. Enter the Carolingian Renaissance, an era that saw a resurgence in art, culture, and learning that would set the stage for the later, more famous Renaissance you probably learned about in high school. But let's not romanticize this too much. This wasn't a time of gentle philosophers debating the finer points of art over wine and cheese. This was still the Middle Ages, with all its gritty, grimy reality. The roads were terrible, the plumbing non-existent, and literacy. Well, let's just say it was more of a niche interest. Charlemagne, however, saw knowledge as power, the real kind, not just the kind that looks good in a tapestry. One of Charlemagne's first moves was to stabilize currency, which is a fancy way of saying he wanted people to actually trust the money in their pockets. He standardized the silver denarius, creating a more reliable economic system. This wasn't just about making his subjects' lives easier. It was about solidifying his control. A stable economy meant a stable kingdom, and that, in turn, meant more resources for his grand cultural project. Charlemagne also knew that to build an empire, he needed more than just loyal knights and sturdy castles. He needed administrators who could keep the whole operation running smoothly. This was a time when government efficiency was an oxymoron, so Charlemagne innovated. He established the Missi Dominii, a system of royal agents who traveled across his empire to ensure that local lords weren't getting too big for their britches. Metaphorically speaking, of course, as britches weren't quite the fashion yet. These agents were crucial in maintaining the king's presence across his vast territories. They acted as mobile troubleshooters, auditors, and occasionally imperial enforcers. The Missi Dominii were a bit like medieval secret sharpers, but instead of checking if the peasants were happy with their grain, they were ensuring that the local counts were paying their taxes and not secretly plotting to overthrow their big boss. As Charlemagne's empire stabilized, he turned his attention to something even more extraordinary for the time: education. He wasn't content with just any old kingdom. He wanted a kingdom of the mind. So, he invited scholars from all over Europe to his court at Aachen, which he fancied as a new Rome. One of his most famous recruits was Alcuin of York, a scholar who was basically the rock star of his day, or at least as close as you could get when your main talents were reading and writing Latin. Alcuin and his fellow intellectuals set about revamping the educational system, which, let's be honest, was in dire need of a makeover. They established cathedral schools that served as the precursors to modern universities. These weren't your standard Hogwarts-style institutions. They focused on the trivium and quadrivium, which sounds like a spell but actually refers to grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Yes, music and astronomy were considered essential learning. Take that, math class. One of the less glamorous but crucial outcomes of this educational reform was the improvement of Latin. Back then, if you could read Latin, you were basically a superhero. It was the language of the church and the educated elite. Unfortunately, the Latin of the time was about as uniform as a tie-dye shirt, with different regions speaking their own versions. Charlemagne's court standardized the language, making it easier for scholars to communicate across vast distances. This linguistic alignment was like the internet of the time, connecting different parts of his empire in a way that was previously impossible. Charlemagne's reign was about more than just power and control. It was about leaving a legacy that would resonate through the ages. His efforts laid the foundation for a cultural revival that, while not quite as glamorous as the Italian Renaissance, was vital in preserving and transmitting knowledge through the tumultuous medieval centuries. It was this focus on learning and culture that truly made him great, not just his battlefield prowess. As we wrap up this first part of our journey, remember that Charlemagne's story is a mix of myth and reality. Yes, he was a conqueror, but he was also a visionary. He saw a world where knowledge could be as powerful as any army, and he built an empire that reflected that vision. In the next installment, we'll dive deeper into the cultural innovations that defined the Carolingian Renaissance and explore how this unlikely Renaissance man inspired generations to come. Stay tuned, because the story of Charlemagne is just getting started. Charlemagne's intellectual ambitions didn't evaporate when the ink dried on his treatise. Nope, they only intensified. He was practically the Elon Musk of his day. But instead of Mars, Charlemagne had his sights set on the stars of knowledge. His court at Aachen became a magnet for scholars across Europe, transforming it into the medieval equivalent of Silicon Valley, without the tech bros or overpriced avocado toast. This wasn't just a vanity project. It was a strategic masterstroke. Let's talk about one of his star players, Alcuin of York. Alcuin was the kind of guy who could walk into a room and make Latin grammar sound like a party trick. He arrived at Charlemagne's court around 782, bringing with him a brain so sharp it could cut through the fog of ignorance that shrouded the Dark Ages. He was tasked with overhauling education, which was then as coherent as a toddler's finger painting. Alcuin's reforms were like a breath of fresh air in a world that still thought leeches were a good cure-all. At the heart of these reforms was the trivium and quadrivium, a curriculum that sounds like it's straight out of Hogwarts, but was actually the cornerstone of medieval education. The trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, wasn't just a trio of fancy words. It was the foundation upon which students learned to think critically and express themselves. Think of it as the original liberal arts degree, minus the student loans. The quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, was all about understanding the universe, or at least trying to, given that the Earth was still the center of it in their worldview. Charlemagne's educational push wasn't just about filling heads with facts. It was about creating a literate class who could manage his sprawling empire. Imagine trying to rule a realm the size of the Holy Roman Empire with administrators who couldn't read your decrees. It'd be like running a company where no one could read the memos. Alcuin's reforms turned Aachen into a buzzing intellectual hub, with scholars copying manuscripts, debating philosophy, and occasionally, perhaps, arguing over who had the best Latin conjugations. Now, let's not get too misty-eyed here. This wasn't an era where every peasant was suddenly learning to read. Literacy was still largely the domain of the clergy and the elite, but the seeds were being sown for future educational systems. Charlemagne's court laid the groundwork for cathedral schools, which would evolve into the universities we know today. So, next time you're cursing your early morning lecture, spare a thought for Charlemagne and Alcuin, who were plotting educational reform, while the rest of the world was still figuring out that maybe bathing more than once a year was a good idea. And let's not overlook the economic context that made these reforms possible. Charlemagne's empire wasn't just about shiny swords and grand titles. It was fueled by a robust economy, bolstered by that standardized silver denarius we mentioned earlier. This economic stability was crucial for funding educational initiatives. After all, scribes need to eat too, even if their diet was more gruel than gourmet. The Carolingian Renaissance wasn't just a cultural movement. It was an economic one, with financial policies that helped fill the imperial coffers, enabling Charlemagne to fund his intellectual pursuits. But here's the kicker. While Charlemagne was busy building a brainier empire, he was also shoring up his political power. By promoting education, he wasn't just creating scholars. He was creating loyal administrators who owed their positions to him. It was a clever move that helped keep his empire glued together. The more educated his officials, the more effective his rule. It was a win-win, unless you were one of the many local lords whose autonomy was slowly being eroded by these new, educated bureaucrats. Despite the romanticism attached to this era, the harsh reality was that education wasn't accessible to the masses. Far from it. Most people were too busy surviving to ponder the finer points of Latin grammar. But the Carolingian reforms set in motion a shift that would eventually ripple across Europe. Like planting seeds in rocky soil, the benefits would take time to flourish, but flourish they did, paving the way for the Renaissance and beyond. Charlemagne's educational legacy is a testament to his vision. He may have been a warrior king, but he knew that true power lay not just in the sword, but in the mind. In a world where ignorance was often more plentiful than bread, Charlemagne's push for knowledge was revolutionary. It was this commitment to learning that would echo through the centuries, proving that while empires may crumble, the pursuit of knowledge is immortal. So as we pause this chapter of Charlemagne's saga, let's appreciate that the so-called Dark Ages were a little brighter thanks to his efforts. The Carolingian Renaissance reminds us that even in the most turbulent times, there's room for greatness, innovation, and a bit of medieval magic. As we continue our journey through this fascinating era, remember that history is full of surprises, and Charlemagne's story is one for the ages. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into the cultural innovations that made this period remarkable. Now, let's dive headfirst into the stone and parchment of the Carolingian Renaissance, where creativity wasn't just encouraged, it was practically mandatory. This era wasn't just a dusty chapter in a history book. It was a full-blown cultural reawakening, with manuscripts, religious iconography, and architecture that screamed ambition louder than a medieval town crier hyping the latest tournament. First up, let's talk about manuscripts. Forget about your dog-eared paperbacks. We're talking about the OGs of literary production. Carolingian manuscripts were the iPads of their day, coveted, valuable, and slightly out of reach for the average Joe. Charlemagne's crew didn't just write books, they transformed them into works of art. The monks in scriptoria, fancy word for medieval writers' rooms, spent endless hours, quills in hand, crafting what we now consider masterpieces. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of Pixar, except their animations were static, and their production timelines were measured in years, not months. The real game-changer here was the introduction of the Carolingian minuscule, a script so innovative and efficient that it would put Time's New Roman to shame. This wasn't just a stylistic choice, it was a practical one. The new script was legible and uniform, making texts easier to read and reproduce. Picture this. Before Carolingian minuscule, trying to read a manuscript was like deciphering a doctor's handwriting after a long night shift. But with the new script, suddenly literacy seemed, dare I say, attainable. Beyond the manuscripts, Carolingian Renaissance saw religious iconography that would make any art historian swoon. These weren't just pretty pictures to fill space between the text. They were visual sermons, preaching to a population that couldn't read. The art was vibrant and meticulous, with a penchant for gold leaf that would make even the Kardashians blush. These images were meant to inspire awe and devotion, serving as a reminder that heaven was watching, and it had a pretty good view. Now, onto architecture, where the Carolingians really flexed their creative muscles. Prior to this era, Frankish architecture was about as exciting as watching paint dry. Functional, sure. Inspiring, not so much. But with Charlemagne at the helm, architecture took a bold step forward. He wanted Aachen, his capital, to rival Rome, and he wasn't shy about it. The Palatine Chapel, completed in 805, was his magnum opus. This wasn't just a building, it was a statement. With its octagonal dome and intricate mosaics, it whispered opulence, or maybe bellowed it, depending on how many denarii you had to rub together. The Palatine Chapel's design was an architectural cocktail, part Roman, part Byzantine, shaken up with Frankish flair. It was a masterstroke of cultural fusion at a time when most buildings were content just to have 4 walls and a roof. Charlemagne's ambition was clear. He wanted his empire to have a divine mandate, and what better way than to build a chapel that looked like it had a direct hotline to the heavens? But let's not gloss over the practicalities. These grand projects came with hefty price tags. Funding the construction of such monumental architecture required deep pockets, and those pockets were filled by the carefully managed economy Charlemagne had cultivated. The standardized currency, the silver denarius, played a crucial role here, ensuring that when Charlemagne decided to splurge on a new apse, the workers were actually getting paid. Despite all the grandeur, it's essential to remember that the Carolingian Renaissance was as much about political power as it was about cultural enlightenment. By adorning his empire with magnificent structures and beautiful manuscripts, Charlemagne wasn't just creating art, he was creating loyalty. The grandeur of his buildings and the beauty of his manuscripts sent a clear message. The Carolingian Empire was chosen by God, and Charlemagne was his instrument. It was a shrewd move, combining faith with function, art with administration. As we explore this era further, it's crucial to acknowledge that while Charlemagne's cultural projects were awe-inspiring, they were also exclusionary. Most of his subjects were too busy tending fields to worry about the latest architectural trends or script styles. Literacy was still a privilege of the elite, and the art that adorned churches and manuscripts was as much about assertion of power as it was about devotion. Yet, in this blend of art and politics, the Carolingian Renaissance set the stage for cultural revival across Europe. The innovations in book production and the ambitious architectural projects laid the groundwork for the future. The manuscripts, with their improved legibility, meant that when the time came for ideas to spread like wildfire, Europe was ready, or at least had the kindling in place. The architecture, with its bold designs, inspired future generations to think bigger, to reach higher, and sometimes to build taller. As we wrap this segment, remember that the Carolingian Renaissance wasn't just about pretty pictures and grand buildings. It was a time of transformation, where art and architecture were wielded as tools of power and influence. It was an era where the past met the future, where tradition met innovation, and where one man's vision left a mark that would echo through the ages. Stay with us as we continue this journey through history, unraveling the complexities and contradictions of a time that was anything but dark. And so, As we delve deeper into Charlemagne's grand tapestry of cultural and political maneuverings, the plot thickens like a medieval stew. By the time 800 CE rolled around, Charlemagne was not just content with being a king, he was aiming for something a bit more celestial. Enter the papal coronation that would make him Emperor of the Romans, a title that wasn't just a shiny badge, but a strategic masterstroke in medieval geopolitics. Let's set the scene. It's Christmas Day in 800, and the air in St. Peter's Basilica is thick with incense and anticipation. Pope Leo Roman III, who had his own reasons to be grateful to Charlemagne, namely the Frankish troops that had helped him reclaim Rome from his enemies, decided it was time to return the favor. The Pope crowned Charlemagne as the Holy Roman Emperor, a title that came with a divine endorsement and enough political weight to tilt the medieval seesaw in Charlemagne's favor. But let's not kid ourselves into thinking this was about spiritual harmony and goodwill. The coronation wasn't just a ceremonial pat on the back. It was a calculated move to intertwine church and state like a medieval power couple. By crowning Charlemagne, Leo Roman III was effectively saying, "Hey, Europe's big enough for the both of us, but let's make sure it stays that way." It was a mutual agreement sealed with a crown, a political maneuver as much as a religious one. On one hand, Charlemagne got the legitimacy he craved, a recognition that his sprawling empire was not just a collection of conquered lands, but a divinely sanctioned realm. On the other hand, the Pope secured a protector, someone who could keep the pesky Lombards and other Italian troublemakers at bay. It was a win-win, assuming you were sitting on a throne or wearing a mitre. For the peasants, well, the church bells rang just the same, and the taxes still came due. So, was this grand cultural boom about enlightenment and progress? Or was it just a clever way to consolidate power? The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Charlemagne's reign was a balancing act between genuine intellectual curiosity and cold, hard political pragmatism. By promoting learning and culture, he wasn't just fostering enlightenment. He was also creating a class of loyal bureaucrats who could help manage his empire. These scholars weren't just bookish types. They were the medieval equivalent of civil servants, ensuring that the empire's wheels kept turning smoothly. In reality, the church-state alliance was as much about control as it was about cooperation. By aligning himself with the papacy, Charlemagne gained access to a network of influence that stretched across Europe. The church, with its ubiquitous presence and moral authority, was the medieval internet, a way to disseminate ideas, laws, and most importantly, Charlemagne's own brand of imperial propaganda. But let's not romanticize this as a benevolent partnership. The intertwining of church and state added layers of complexity to Charlemagne's reign, like a tapestry woven with threads of gold and iron. The church wasn't just an ally, it was also a rival power center. The Pope's blessing was a double-edged sword. Sure, it came with divine approval, but it also meant that Charlemagne's legitimacy was, in part, contingent on papal favor. And in a world where papal politics were as stable as a Jenga tower, that was a precarious position to be in. While Charlemagne's coronation marked the zenith of his power, it also set the stage for future conflicts between emperors and popes. The alliance was a delicate dance, with each partner trying to lead. The emperor needed the church's moral authority, but he also had to ensure that the pope didn't overstep. It was a relationship built on mutual need and mutual suspicion, a medieval version of keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Economically, this church-state nexus had significant implications. The church controlled vast tracts of land and resources, and its support was crucial for maintaining the empire's financial stability. Tithes and church taxes filled the coffers, while monastic lands provided crucial agricultural output. This wasn't just a cultural renaissance. It was an economic engine, with the church acting as both beneficiary and benefactor. Yet, for all the grandeur and power plays, the reality was that most of Charlemagne's subjects experienced little of this cultural flowering firsthand. The vast majority of the population was still illiterate, their lives dictated by the rhythms of the agricultural calendar rather than the intellectual pursuits of the court. The cultural renaissance was largely an elite affair, a top-down project that, while laying the groundwork for future advancements, was still out of reach for most. Despite this, The Carolingian Renaissance sowed seeds that would eventually germinate into the broader European Renaissance centuries later. The reforms in education, the innovations in script, and the architectural feats would echo through history, influencing generations of thinkers and builders. Charlemagne's legacy was not just an empire of land, but an empire of ideas, one that straddled the line between myth and reality. As we continue our journey through this era, it's crucial to appreciate the dual nature of Charlemagne's reign. He was a ruler who wielded both sword and scepter, who saw cultural revival as both a means of enlightenment and a tool of power. The Carolingian Renaissance was a testament to human ambition, both its heights and its hubris. And as we peel back the layers of this complex tapestry, we find a story that is as much about the human condition as it is about history. Stay tuned as we explore how this intricate dance between power, politics, and culture continued to shape Charlemagne's empire and beyond. The story isn't over yet, and the next chapter promises even more intrigue and insight into the medieval world that was anything but dark. As we plunge into the denouement of Charlemagne's grand narrative, let's sift through the glittering embellishments to uncover the true essence of the Carolingian Renaissance. Was it a genuine beacon of progress lighting up the murky medieval skies, or merely a sophisticated PR campaign by a ruler who knew the power of image? The answer, like most things in history, isn't neatly wrapped up with a bow, but rather tangled in a web of ambition, necessity, and a touch of medieval spin. For starters, the Carolingian Renaissance was undeniably a period of significant cultural output. Sure, it might not have had the pizzazz of the Italian Renaissance, with its Davids and Sistine ceilings, but it laid down some serious groundwork. Take the preservation of classical texts, for instance. Those monks scribbling away in dimly lit scriptoria weren't just passing time. They were safeguarding the intellectual treasures of antiquity. Without their painstaking efforts, we'd be missing a hardy chunk of the Western canon today. We're talking about works from the likes of Virgil and Cicero, whose texts were copied and recopied, ensuring that future generations wouldn't be left in the dark ages of ignorance. But let's not pretend this was purely an altruistic endeavor. Charlemagne and his intellectual cronies, like Alcuin of York, had more than a passing interest in the past. They weren't just history buffs, they were strategic thinkers. By reviving Roman culture and scholarship, they were crafting a narrative that positioned Charlemagne as the rightful heir to Rome's storied legacy. It was a branding exercise on an imperial scale, a way to legitimize his rule and project power across his sprawling empire. This wasn't just about dusting off old scrolls. It was about building a lineage, connecting the Frankish ruler to the grandeur of Rome itself. And then there's the education system. Those cathedral schools didn't just pop up because Charlemagne was feeling benevolent. They were designed to train the next generation of bureaucrats who could keep his empire from collapsing under its own weight. The trivium and quadrivium weren't just academic exercises. They were the building blocks for a functional administration. A literate, educated elite was essential for managing an empire that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Danube. And while it's tempting to view this as a noble pursuit of knowledge for knowledge's sake, it was as much about control as it was about enlightenment. After all, a well-informed administrator is far less likely to embezzle your taxes if he can actually read the rulebook. Yet, despite the somewhat calculated motivations, the long-term impacts of this renaissance were profound. The seeds planted in the Carolingian era would eventually blossom into the university system we recognize today. Institutions like the University of Paris and Bologna owe a debt to those early cathedral schools, where the curriculum of grammar, rhetoric, and logic laid the foundation for more advanced studies. The ripple effects of Charlemagne's educational reforms spread far and wide, influencing the shape of European education for centuries. But let's not get too carried away with the romance of it all. For the average serf toiling away in Charlemagne's fields, this cultural rebirth was as relevant as a philosophy lecture on a Friday night. The benefits of the Carolingian Renaissance were largely confined to the upper echelons of society. The peasants' lives continued much as they had for generations, dictated by the whims of weather and the demands of the harvest. The literacy rates among the general population remained abysmally low, and most people were more concerned with the immediate realities of survival than with the lofty ideals of learning. Nevertheless, the legacy of the Carolingian Renaissance is undeniable. It was a period that bridged the gap between antiquity and modernity, preserving the intellectual heritage of the past while sowing the seeds for future innovation. The era's focus on education and cultural revival played a crucial role in shaping the European identity, setting the stage for the scholarly pursuits of the High Middle Ages and beyond. And what can this era teach us about today's world? For one, the power of spin is nothing new. Charlemagne understood that perception often trumps reality, and he wielded cultural revival as a tool of political legitimacy and control. It's a reminder that even in the past, leaders were acutely aware of the importance of image and narrative. Moreover, the Carolingian Renaissance demonstrates the enduring value of education and cultural preservation. In a world where information is often fleeting, the painstaking efforts to preserve and disseminate knowledge remind us of the importance of continuity and the need to safeguard our intellectual heritage. In the end, Charlemagne's story is a testament to the complexities of human ambition. He was a warrior and a visionary, a ruler who understood that power wasn't just about wielding a sword, but about shaping minds. The Carolingian Renaissance was a multifaceted endeavor, a blend of genuine progress and calculated politics. It was an era that, despite its limitations, left an indelible mark on history, proving that even in the most tumultuous times, there is room for enlightenment and innovation. As we close the book on this chapter of history, let's appreciate the duality of the Carolingian Renaissance. It was a time of contradictions, where art and politics intertwined, where the pursuit of knowledge served both enlightenment and empire. The legacy of this era is a reminder that history is rarely black and white, but rather a tapestry of ambition, ingenuity, and a touch of medieval magic. So next time you walk past a university or flip through a classic text, spare a thought for Charlemagne and his motley crew of scholars, who, in their quest for power and knowledge, helped lay the foundations for the world we know today.